Hi, welcome everyone. We will wait a few seconds since people are still joining. And yeah, we will start in 2 minutes. Okay, so it looks that it's stabilizing. We have 70 people around. We can wait a few more seconds.
Still rolling.
Yeah.
That's a lot. Those messages.
Okay, so we will start. First, welcome and thank you for being here. I'll just start with some housekeeping and some practical information, and then I'll hand it over to Deirde Tobias. So first, we want to thank the Brigham Research Institute for funding this symposium. And just the practical information, please stay muted during the talks, and we will have a short Q&A session after this each shorter session, so you can leave your questions and I'll read them out loud after each talk, or we will unmute yourself so that you can speak and ask your question out loud. So if you have questions, just raise your hand. That would also be an option. And so I think we can give it. We have over 100 people now in, so I guess we can just start straight. So please.
Awesome. Wow. All right. Thank you so much. We're really excited to have this opportunity to present some progress and ideas that have been sort of stewing over the last few years in this intersection of causal inference, referring to the methods and the approaches and the thinking with nutritional epidemiology. And there's a lot more people online than there are in the room. So I feel like I'm not talking to too many people. So please, you guys the pressure's on you to be as interactive as possible. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers here today, many who have flown in from international to join us on their way to the SER mid-year meeting. So check that out as well. And these topics include why diet is so difficult, emulation of dietary intervention trials, diet as a compound treatment and what that means, as well as considerations for transportability and versions of treatment. And then we also have a number of speakers today presenting their works in progress, which is really exciting to see some of the tools and applications that we'll discuss actually apply to real world data. Then Dr. Ibsen will discuss some next steps and all of the glaring omissions of what we presented and what left is work there is to do. And then Dr. Stern will close us out. So you'll note that this ends at 4 and not 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. So you get an hour back. and you're amazing if you stayed through that whole 4 hours anyway. This will be recorded and posted hopefully in like the next week or so to the nutrition.brigham.harvard.org or edu. I can't remember. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It'll be posted and we'll announce that when it is. So without further ado, I wanted to just welcome everyone with a quick icebreaker. And I think hopefully by the end of the next couple of slides, you'll get a little bit of an appreciation of why we are motivated to understand causal inference and nutritional epidemiology. So everyone in the room, like I said, pressure's on you, as well as everyone at home, with a show of hands up if you think it's healthy for the items that I'll show, fingers down if you think it's unhealthy. All right, so practice, get it out. Okay, go ahead, no judgment, you're not on camera. All right, so here we go. Chocolate chip cookie. All right, thumbs down. Olive oil, thumbs up. Blueberries, thumbs up. All right. Those are dinosaur chicken nuggets. Okay, I won't tell my kids the answer to this one. Coffee. All right, some people even in the middle. White rice, this is polished white rice. Orange juice. 100% orange juice? Let's change anyone? Okay. Diet Coke. Wow, okay. And cheese. So they got a little bit harder along the way. Okay, well, congratulations. If you felt compelled to vote on any of those, you already have an appreciation for epidemiology because there has literally never been a single randomized controlled trial with a health outcome for any one of those foods. So whatever strong feelings you had are based entirely on observational evidence or short-term mechanistic studies. So with that, we're going to discuss how we can learn more from observational data in addition to whatever conclusions you might have already felt you could draw from the past 8 or so foods. And the first segment of our symposium, I just hope to introduce some fundamental reasons why we think diet might be particularly difficult to study. And it's not unique to diet. There's many other exposures and interventions and really important medical interventions and deliveries that we could also fit into this category. But for diet in particular, because it is so relevant, we're all eating every day, unless you're intermittent fasting, then this is, of course, an exposure on top of most of our minds. So my disclosures, I'm funded by the NIH and ADA and have no financial conflicts of interest. So a dozen or 13 baker's dozen of the world's leading nutrition experts were asked to rank 105 items, including the ones that you just saw on the last couple of slides. And this figure, I think, shows a lot of the heterogeneity that even experts have, particularly around the middle. You see some foods. So each column refers to a food item, and a row is one of these experts. And you can see some columns are really mixed with some dark red and green for the exact same food, right? But if you look kind of like step back, big picture, there's actually quite a bit of agreement as well. And with many of these foods relying largely on observational and epidemiologic data to even come to these types of conclusions that we might have about is something healthy or not, this really begs the question of, well, why then does it also seem at the same time so incredibly difficult to get causal answers from dietary exposure hypotheses? So there's certainly a lot of evidence to indicate that diet is a major contributor to health and disease. And with the flux in health outcomes and major causes of death around the world, or this is the United States, over the last century, we can see that it hasn't been stagnant as any one major cause. Influenza came and went, COVID came and did not went yet. And then we have heart disease coming up and going down, cancer fluxing. If you looked within subtypes of cancer, you'd see a lot more heterogeneity there as well. But all of this illustrating that there's clearly something environmental happening for some of these long-term chronic diseases. And diet being a plausible cause for many of these is certainly possible. Also, we see heterogeneity in, for example, colorectal cancer could have picked any real health outcome. And the heterogeneity around the world also points to the fact that there's environmental drivers that we as epidemiologists would really like to understand, characterize, and then determine how to intervene on to mitigate these risks. So this is an example of an observational ecologic study, which many decades ago was about as good as computers could get. But we have, for example, plotted on the y-axis the mortality of breast cancer at the country level. So what is the breast cancer mortality rate in Japan, Chile, Finland, Denmark, plotted against their country level intake of total dietary fat. And this kind of data is hypothesis generating at best. And if you're an epidemiologist and you've sat through Epi 101, that's exactly what it's defined as, hypothesis generating. But beyond that, we have a lot of limitations in drawing anything about causality. This is first and foremost a single point in time, but we also don't know what was the dietary fat intake among the women who died of breast cancer. There's no individual level data tying the exposure to the outcome, along with all of the other potential confounders between countries, between individuals, and other considerations as just an exposure outcome relationship you might want to be able to evaluate. And then following up observational data, like with the ecological studies with individual level assessment of diet, followed prospectively now for breast cancer risk. This is an example of fat intake with breast cancer from the Nurses' Health Study, published in the 90s, one of the first papers with enough follow-up to really look at the Nurses' Health Study questionnaires with a health outcome. And we can see that, despite the hypothesis that fat might be related to breast cancer, when we look at the individual level data, it does not seem to be that consistent with what the country level trends were indicating. So at the lowest level of intake, less than 30% calories from fat per day, all the way up to almost over 50, there doesn't seem to be that strong of a trend. And all of these bars cross one, indicating no real relationship with breast cancer and total fat intake. So even with epidemiology, improving upon the method, going from ecologic to observational cohort data, we can see arriving at very different conclusions with these improvements. And that then, of course, led to the Women's Health Initiative, which was it is the largest dietary intervention trial ever conducted. Enrolled almost 50,000 women, randomized them to a low fat, less than 20% of energy from fat, dietary pattern compared with no intervention. So just keep going with whatever it is your usual intake is. And over 8.1 years of follow-up and hundreds and thousands, if not millions of person years later, what do you think it showed compared to the observational cohort? So now we have a randomized intervention, no confounding at baseline, but certainly everybody's well aware of their intervention assignment, and they're out in the real world consuming and making these choices on their own. But at the end of the day, virtually identical conclusion as the observational data, with no effect of being randomized to low-fat diet on breast cancer incidence. Similarly, with the Mediterranean diet, the 7-country study consisted of dozens of cohorts, and this is the data replotted just a few years ago now with country level Mediterranean diet adherence score, if you can call it that. So not plotting necessarily the country, which was originally done, but how aligned with a Mediterranean type diet on average that country's diet or that cohort's was against its cardiovascular disease risk over the next 50 years. So with this, we see that back in the 1960s, countries that had an overall Mediterranean-like diet, so those are higher scores down here on the right. Can you see the pointer at home? No?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, all right, perfect. There was, among those countries, again, at the country level, a lower risk of coronary heart disease over the next 50 years. Again, compelling ecological data, hypothesis generating at most. What we would want to know is at the individual level, were the individuals within these populations that were consuming Mediterranean diet-like patterns, the ones experiencing lower disease risk? Can we adjust for individual level confounders and all of the other lifestyle behaviors that would correlate with this type of dietary pattern? So of course, we know that's been done in dozens of cohorts now, and all consistently, in this case, unlike total fat and breast cancer, fairly consistent with what the ecological data were suggesting. So on average, we have across these cohorts, comparing those with the highest versus lowest adherence to some Mediterranean diet score, around a 30% lower risk of developing heart disease over follow-up. And what trial led next out of this data was PREDIMED. And so PREDIMED, like the low-fat test in the Women's Health Initiative, was testing that hypothesis about the Mediterranean diet in contrast with a low-fat diet, which at the time would have been considered the standard care advice for incidence of cardiovascular disease. And so these lines here are the cumulative incidence of cardiovascular for the control diet. These were actively engaged in an intervention to adhere to a low-fat pattern versus the Mediterranean diet, which was broken further into two arms of either enhancing intake of nuts or olive oil. And you can see, regardless of that, the Mediterranean groups had about a 30% lower risk of cardiovascular disease than low-fat. So building on the observational data, it seems that with the improvements that a simple cohort structure can make above and beyond something like an ecologic observation, in many instances have gotten very close to what the subsequent randomized clinical trial demonstrated. But there have also been many instances in when we have gotten it spectacularly wrong. And that is really the bane of our existence. We don't have the ability to follow up every sort of compelling trend in the observational data with a long-term randomized trial for hard clinical endpoints. So we're left with the rest of the literature wondering, okay, is this right? Is this wrong? What do we eat? And in this case, this is a meta-analysis forest plot of egg intake with cardiovascular disease, which may make an appearance again later. And I'm going to zoom in on the hazard ratio in a second, but obviously they're all over the place. And, you know, if we had these sorted chronologically, it would probably make your head spin with headlines of eggs are good, eggs are bad, eggs are good, eggs are bad. So clearly something is happening in these data that are not always telling the nice stories that we get out of breast cancer and total fat and Mediterranean diet and cardiovascular disease, which brings us here today. So, you know, we have this pooled average of extremely heterogeneous values, is a whopping 4% higher risk with each additional egg per day. It might also be 1, it might also be 8, and this is nothing you can clinically act on, right? So we're still left wondering what on earth to say about eggs. Similarly, we have this other plot that had been published trying to highlight the heterogeneity in epidemiology and how essentially useless the field might be because we can't even determine what foods are related to cancer or not. And if you picked any food in any type of cancer endpoint, you'll find just as many studies saying it prevents cancer as it harms cancer. So clearly there's, you know, a moment in time where there's enough frustration where there has to be improvements. And I think over the last decade, we'll get to what some of those might have been. And the alternative perspective is just to say we absolutely have no idea. If you look at the egg example, if you look at alcohol, if you pick any dietary exposure, its relationship with the health outcome might be so all over the place. How could we possibly use this tool any further with any confidence? And when the red meat, processed and unprocessed red meat and NutriRec's recommendations hit the headlines a few years ago, the senior author, Dr. Guyot, was interviewed to just describe the overall impact of their findings on red meat with cancer and cardiovascular disease, in which they ultimately recommended really just eat whatever amount of red meat you want, because we can't say anything at the end of the day. And in this interview, when James Hambleman asked him if Dr. Guyot felt that clinicians could advise their patients on even something as starkly contrasted as whether a salad is healthier than a bowl of sugar, that because all of this is evidence based on observational epidemiology, the quality of evidence is so low, it depends almost entirely on their preferences. So if you hold this stringent perspective of data's all over the place, therefore we know nothing, and stop there, it ends up being quite a disservice to everyone who's still asking, how do we make a healthy diet? How do we make healthy choices when we know there's so many preventable chronic diseases tied directly back to these dietary choices in our food environment? And next, I'm just going to highlight a few other examples of why, not only because of cost and adherence and getting people on board and the intensity it takes to run something like the Women's Health Initiative or the PREDIMED trials, there are many interventions and outcomes that would be completely unethical to do a randomized controlled trial for. Yet at the same time, there have been many policies that have been not just around food, but about many different environmental exposures that have similarly not needed the gold standard, quote unquote, of a large scale randomized trial, of which usually there's just one, because replication would be another, added burden, with the ability to make policy. So I think neural tube defects is one of these examples where the observational trends indicated there was, looking back, a very concerning flux of these neural tube defects in infants born, specifically in New England hospitals, but also elsewhere around the world. And looking back over the records to understand why there would be this sudden rise, there was this clear similar influx that had happened in the 30s and 40s, which of course was around the time of World War II. So what was happening in Boston and Providence is obviously what you would then want to ask. It was not, actively engaged in war in those sites, but obviously very much, that's where society was wrapped up in. But there were a lot of dietary and nutritional deficiencies emerging around that same time, just due to the situation and the economy and a lot of the supply for the Boston and Providence areas and elsewhere. So that led the investigators, down the road of, well, what mechanistically might be happening, what might diet or other aspects of environment at that time changing might be responsible for these trends, and that the folate and the folic acid story was born out of this initial observation, where if we made sure that women were adequate in their folate status going into pregnancy, then it would have a massive impact on the risk of neural tube defects. But how would that possibly be a trial? You can't withhold folic acid if you have that strong of a hypothesis, especially for such a devastating health outcome. So the policies and the fortification of the food supply in the US to add folic acid to a lot of processed grains and other foods was not based on a large-scale population randomized trial. It was high-risk short-term studies, mechanistic evidence, and epidemiology. And the same goes for trans fat, which was first banned by other countries, including Denmark. We have some colleagues from there here today. And eventually in the United States, again, there was no large-scale randomized trial. The evidence was already clearly indicating that short-term metabolic profiles with blood pressure and dyslipidemia and atherosclerosis were already indicating quite clearly that this was not a substance you could assume was inert and proceed ethically with a randomized trial for many, many years. So you see the observational epi with as crude of an estimate of trans fat intake this might be, and not even decades and decades of follow-up yet, there's already this striking trend of nearly a threefold higher risk in heart disease risk with those at the top end of trans fat consumption. So what did policymakers do about this? With the sort of overwhelming mechanistic short-term trial and epidemiologic evidence, it was clear that this substance, which was industrially manufactured, could be easily removed from the food supply. The safest bet was probably to just remove it. There wasn't a big call for a large long-term RCT to really understand once and for all, is this a causal relationship? And triangulation of all the other data was certainly compelling enough. So if we're relying then, and out of necessity and ethics, to use observational data as one of the tools in all of this data triangulation, just given the egg meta-analysis and many other studies like that, not to pick on the eggs, we certainly need to improve the tool of observational epidemiology, if that's going to be a mainstay of our decision making, as it should be. So questions such as, is red meat bad for us? Are vegetables good for us? If this was asking about statins or insulin or massive acute radiation exposure, that's probably good enough. That's a very self-explanatory exposure. You don't need to necessarily clarify that you mean radiation compared to no radiation. They all have kind of, do nothing option. Some of them even have placebo options. But with diet, and this is what I'm going to walk through now, is the structure of the data in their natural environment, not just because of how it's collected, is what really makes it a bit different from these other sort of exposures that we're used to. All right, so what we're going to then walk through now is diet as a compositional exposure. And this is what I mean by compositional. So compositional data is data that's quantitative parts of some whole, and that whole is fixed, although it might be dynamic over time. And you can think of this lovely 1990s, 1980s TV dinner tray as your total daily energy requirement in homeostasis. So that's your fixed whole. It's not a sum of the parts. It's determined by other factors, right? So for total energy, your serving tray is determined by your body size, your age, your physical activity levels, your resting metabolic rate, all of these drivers that indicate this is your fixed whole, okay? Then within that, we have our components. They are the compositional pieces that quantitatively fill that tray. So the foods, the chicken, I think that's chicken, corn, mashed potatoes, those would be your components, and they must sum to that whole. So that's just a law of compositional data, right? So if you remove the corn or take one of the chicken wings away, then it has to be filled in with something else, right? Okay. So this then is the underlying sort of motivation for why if you were designing a trial, but now hopefully in observational data, we are increasingly aware that we need to say compared to what, right? So radiation exposure compared to no radiation exposure. Insulin compared to maybe some placebo shot, if you're worried about, the injection having some sort of effect on its own. There is no do nothing for diet. As far as I know, there is no completely inert source of calorie equivalent placebo that doesn't exist. So we're left then with this compositional data, knowing we have to sum to some fixed total, asking compared to what. And here's why. So if we have a hypothesis of if the US quit eating red meat, would the 10-year incidence of heart disease be lower than if consumption of red meat had just continued on its way for the next 10 years? That's a real question that someone might want to ask. We see heart disease is a very costly major cause of death in the United States. A lot of plausible biology would indicate red meat might be an exposure of concern. So how would we address that hypothesis? And it's not just, is red meat bad for heart disease? So if we did do a hypothetical trial where we told the entire United States to quit eating red meat, or it was a policy, or we tried it out in Utah or something and saw what happened, the problem there is the interpretation, right? So people might actually limit their red meat, or maybe you forced them and they didn't no longer have access to red meat. But the actual estimate is not something that can be described in words without some additional data. So if you remove, again, this component of their, or reduce this component of their compositional fixed tray, it has to be filled in with something else. So in the absence of describing, defining, having your protocol explicitly say what that something else is, it's left to all the other behavioral choices and options and environment that might be available to them. So if you're thinking that individuals would replace it with some other major source of protein, and that was an assumption you made, then you know it's red meat compared to salmon, poultry, legumes, beans, all that. But you're not really sure what combination they're in because that wasn't something you specified. So it's poorly defined in that sense. Also, it would be quite the assumption to assume that nothing else about their diet changed, right? We know that there's a lot of collinearity and dynamic correlations between every food item that we choose to eat and don't choose to eat. So, you know, bacon and eggs. If you're decreasing sugary beverages, you're most likely increasing diet beverages. That's like just fact of data. And you can either not define that and just say it's the effect of quitting red meat, but at the end of the day, you're left not knowing what it is compared to. So an improvement upon that would, to get a better defined question, and in the end, a better defined and interpretable effect estimate. The isocaloric piece is fixed, right? So if I had 1,000 people here, 1,000 people there, and I intervened in one to quit red meat because of this, law of homeostasis, we know they would increase something else. So if we explicitly told them, replace your meat with salmon, now we have a specific contrast in mind, right? But we also know that when you eat salmon, maybe you prefer different side dishes. You're not outside grilling, maybe you're going to be making a salad instead. And there are other sort of effects that in this network of all the decision-making processes of food that would be impacted just by that swap to salmon. So even better specified would be eat the exact same amount of mashed potatoes you did before. Eat that nasty brownie in the middle, just like you did before. The green beans, keep them exactly the same, just change that meat and that salmon. So now all of the side dishes are held constant. And the only contrast between these two trays, because it's explicitly defined this way, are the two meat and salmon, right? So everything else would be an assumption. If you assumed the green beans were the same between groups, but you didn't explicitly define that, I don't know that assumption would necessarily hold. So fixing the sides, explicitly stating the contrast, you now have a more clearly defined exposure. And so single nutrient interventions, so foods are kind of easy to think about swapping, but below the layer of components on your tray are all the subcomponents of each component. And unlike something like your microbiome abundance or ecological models of compositional data where the giraffes increase and the monkeys go down, we have these components in flux are also comprised of subcomponents that can be shared across each of these major foods. So saturated fat, for example, doesn't come from just one food. So if your hypothesis is reducing saturated fat, it could come from any number of foods that contain saturated fat. So how then would you better define that question so you even know at the end of the day what you're modeling? And so this is a table just showing the intake or the content of saturated fat in a portion of red meat. And you can see it's about 20%. That's not a negligible amount. So if you intervened on your population to reduce saturated fat, and say they actually did specify saturated fat from meat, there are so many ways to go about this that require additional specificity to understand what your contrast is at the end of the day. So first and foremost, you could avoid the red meat altogether, right? So maybe that would be replacing it with salmon, something else, although there are a lot of things different between salmon and red meat than just the saturated fat, right? So now you have confounding by all of these other factors. You could also reformulate, right? So you could make lean meat and sell that at the grocery store. That's available, but you can see how many other types of fat. So there's just as much mono and saturated fat. So just opting for lean meat as a way to reduce saturated fat introduces confounding as well, because now we have fatty red meat versus lean red meat, and they're different in so many other ways than just the saturated fat. Maybe you could design meat to be specifically different in only saturated fat content. And that's certainly possible with a lot of foods. Meat was probably a bad example for that. Ultra processed foods and other processed foods, I think are a great example of like wrapping your head around modifying a single feature of a given food to understand how fixed everything else within that food needs to be. But if you either reduce the saturated fat in the meat, not for the lean version, or replace, then you have to understand those are calories you have to replace from somewhere else, right? So maybe it's increasing the amount of mono and saturated fat in the meat. Maybe you can design cows to be like that. I don't know. Then, or the reduced saturated fat calories, you can replace with calories from other foods. So maybe you add a bunch of olive oil to the meat to get it back up to the same amount of calories of the version that has saturated fat. And then the other option is to just make that red meat a bigger portion size, right? So you just make that piece bigger. And all of that is just with this compositional structure of knowing you have to fill in the same amount of fixed energy requirements within the course of a day or year. And then just also one quick comment that if we acknowledge data is compositional and diet when we intervene on any one item or talk about people who eat more, there's always those who are eating less of that item that are eating something else, right? And if we did this big red meat trial and had everybody in the United States no longer have access to some food, and just we observed at the end of the 10 years, in fact, heart disease risk went lower, that would be internally valid. We would say our policy to do this led to lower risk of heart disease, XYZ. That's internal validity. There aren't major concerns otherwise for that. But the problem really is in this interpretation, because if that exact same policy was implemented, like the egg analyses in 100 different countries, you would get completely different answers if you weren't specific on what they had to eat instead, what was fixed, and so forth. So, I don't even know where we would begin to describe what was studied here. And that's really the problem with a poorly defined intervention is if you say quit something or eat more of something and you don't know compared to what, then it really is almost moot that the study was even conducted to begin with. So this, ultimately lacks generalizability, and there's no clear understanding of what we would expect if we kind of pass the policy on to another population to consider implementing. Okay, so, just a few more. So the meta-analysis on the top here is looking at red meat and heart disease. So we see this is all over the place. it's no wonder people would conclude we have no idea what to tell people to eat about certain foods, because you can see the heterogeneity without even having to dig into the individual studies. Is just maddening. But an improvement on top of that is this level of specificity. So if we explicitly contrast while holding the background diet constant, one food against another, we can see that all of these point estimates on the bottom meta-analysis are the effect estimate for red meat, okay? All of these are red meat. And you can see within the same population, they're all over the place. But that's because they're contrasted explicitly against very different foods. So when we, in the same participants, say, what is the relationship of red meat against the same amount of calories from nuts, you can see that it's very different than if we had said from the same amount of calories of chicken or turkey without skin, like lean white meats, right? Eggs and red meat, relatively neutral. All right, so that's, so substitution analyses are really driving in this direction of better defining exposures and defining them, meaning in the context of this inherent compositional data structure that even if you ask a question naive to that structure, it's still there. So the rest of the talks will hopefully introduce some really important tools and concepts that build on all of this. And so, why is diet so difficult? And I realize that's kind of a terrible title. It's not dieting. So if that's what you were expecting, I'm sorry. It's diet data. And yes, so fantastic speakers will introduce some really important additional concepts. And if you had a lot of questions during that thought or during that talk, I'm sure they'll be brought up in the next couple of hours. So thank you. And next we have, I don't know if there were any questions or we could just move on.
Yeah. So are there any questions? I don't know. Yeah, no. Are there any questions? Okay. So then there's someone's raising their hand online. Can you unmute, or do you need access? Like, do you need me to unmute you?
If not, then just do the
otherwise
question. Just do the question. Yeah.
Sorry for that.
We can come back to that.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So next up, we have Dr. Dalia Stern, who comes from Mexico City, discussing emulation of dietary intervention trials. So I think this will build on very nicely, and welcome, Dalia. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And today I'm going to be talking about key concepts when thinking about emulating dietary trial interventions. So first, we need to think about observational data in randomized controlled trials. And even if ideally we would like to conduct a randomized trial to test the effectiveness of sustained dietary strategies on long-term health, we know that it's very impractical and that we also face many challenges when asking people to maintain adherence to their dietary strategy assignment. So this is where observational cohorts can actually help us answer the questions that we're interested in that randomized controlled trials will probably never answer. And an additional thing about observational data is that they actually reflect the diets that are achievable and sustainable in the real world. And here's where the target trial framework really comes into play. So first off, what is the target trial? So the target trial is the hypothetical randomized trial that we would like to conduct to answer a causal question. And when thinking about causal questions or answering a causal question of interest, we can think of it as a two-step process. So first, we need to ask the causal question of interest, and then we have to answer this question. So to ask the causal question, we can think of this as specifying the protocol of our hypothetical trial. To answer that question, we could either conduct the target trial. I've already said that in nutrition, this is probably very hard. Or we could use observational data to explicitly emulate this hypothetical trial that we're interested in. And here are just a couple of slides on how we do this. When thinking about our target trial protocol, there are many elements that we need to think of and specify to be able to answer our causal question of interest. So we need to clearly define our eligibility criteria, our treatment strategies, how we're going to assign people to treatment, the follow-up, our outcomes of interest, our causal contrast, and our analysis plan. Once that it's specified, we need to look at our observational data and see if we're going to be able to emulate our protocol and what are going to be the assumptions that we're going to be willing or that we're willing to make in order to emulate this target trial protocol. Why am I talking about this? Why is this important? It's because it helps us avoid certain biases. When we align the design and analysis of observational data with a randomized trial, we can avoid some problems. And it can also help us resolve some discrepancies that we can observe between the two different study designs. And before I even talk about diet, I want to give an example of something that happened that I think it's very illustrative, and it will help us think through diet as well. And it's the example of hormone replacement therapy use in heart disease amongst postmenopausal women. So as you can see here, there's discrepant evidence between what observational studies found and what the Women's Health Initiative randomized trial found. So evidence from the Nurses' Health Study, this evidence from observational studies actually came before the trial. They observed a 30% lower rate of heart disease amongst current versus never users. In contrast, when the results of the trial were published, they reported a 20% higher rate comparing initiators of hormone replacement therapy versus non-initiators. So you're probably already asking yourselves, did observational studies get this completely wrong? What happened? So I will very briefly talk through each of the two studies. So for the randomized trial, women were randomly assigned to treatment initiation or placebo. And almost everybody assigned to initiation received at least one dose of treatment, so they were classified as initiators. And the analysis was actually comparing new or incident users of hormone replacement therapy versus non-initiators. And here's where the key difference with observational data is. So this trial helps inform or make decisions about therapy initiation. But when we think about what happened with the analysis of observational data, and we think about how hormone replacement therapy was measured, women were basically asked to report whether they use or not hormone replacement therapy. And participants were classified as current, past, or never users. So in this case, if you think about this, we're not talking about new users of hormone replacement therapy. This is a question about people that are prevalent users versus those that never use hormone replacement therapy. So if we think about this, who are these women? Who are these people? So basically, prevalent users are going to be women who have been using hormone replacement therapy for a while, who survived a cardiovascular event, who were then eligible to be part of the cohort, and were still using hormones. So we're basically studying superwomen, those that survive our outcome of interest. And this might potentially explain the discrepant results. And when you think about what type of decision a study like this might inform, it's actually really hard and even not clinically relevant, because women are going to, if women are considering whether to initiate or to discontinue hormone replacement therapy, this type of analysis and research question is not asking, it is not answering that question, sorry. So, of course, people thought about this, and they actually went and reanalyzed the Nurses' Health study to answer the same question as what the Women's Health Initiative was asking. And instead of studying current versus never users, they aligned or emulated the WHI trial using observational data to compare the risk amongst incident users versus non-users. And as you can see here, in like the overall, we still observe differences, confidence intervals are wide, but the reanalysis is not concluding that it is better to take hormone replacement therapy, right? And also when thinking about or stratifying this by the number of years of follow-up or the years since menopause, both studies following a similar protocol, we find results that align pretty well. The reason why the Nurses' Health study couldn't estimate the risk amongst people that have had menopause for more than 20 years is because women from the Women's Health Initiative were older. So what I want to convey here is that there was not a problem of the data, right? This is something that people criticize a lot when thinking about observational data. Observational studies are not good or not sufficiently good as compared to randomized trial. And the other thing that I want to highlight here is that confounding was also not a sufficient explanation for this. Clearly, observational studies in the trial were asking very different questions. And why am I talking about this, and why is this even important? It's because when thinking about nutrition epidemiology, and as Didi already mentioned, the studies have been criticized widely because for many questions, the evidence is all over the place. The majority of the times, the main criticisms are around confounding and measurement error, right? However, there was a study that was published very recently where authors were comparing similar questions that were asked in observational studies and randomized trial. And what they actually found when they were comparing the study protocols is that there was a really important lack of alignment between the protocols. So basically, none of the 97 diet disease outcome pairs that were compared were rated as more or less identical. 59% were similar, but not identical, and 41% were broadly similar. So we're basically in the hormone replacement therapy era in nutrition epidemiology. And what I want to convey is that the majority of the times, dietary observational studies in randomized trials are asking very different questions, which is what motivates the target trial approach. So now, in this part of my talk, what I want to discuss is what are the differences with a traditional analysis in nutrition epidemiology as opposed to what we're doing if we're emulating a target trial. And to do this, I'm using a manuscript that was published by 2 of our colleagues that are going to be presenting here today. And this was a hypothetical 22-year intervention with the dietary approaches to stop hypertension, so the DASH diet, and risk of heart failure in the general population. So the objective of this study was to estimate the effect of long-term adherence to the DASH diet on the 22-year risk of heart failure in middle-aged Swedish men and women. So to start, Didi already mentioned this. What I think it's very important is that with diet, we don't have treatment-naive populations. We're exposed to diet or foods since we're born or when we're very young. And this, of course, has implications for the type of questions that we're asking. In this case, you can see on, I guess it's going to be the left side of the slide, is the eligibility criteria, the start of follow-up, and the outcomes for the target trial protocol. And then on the right-hand side is the target trial emulation. And one of the first things that I would like to highlight is that when we think about a DASH score in a traditional analysis, and the type of question that we're asking is assuming that what we measured at baseline reflects the effect of lifelong dietary habits, which is quite different from the question that we would be asking if we emulate a dietary trial. In this case, if you see here, the target trial is asking a question about the potential effect of changing our diet at the time of eligibility. In this case, eligibility was defined as men and women being recruited in 1997, having 45 years or older, and not having cardiovascular disease or history of cancer at baseline. And as you can see, the target trial framework also is very clear about when we start following up people. So this would be in our hypothetical target trial would be after randomization, and it will end if experiencing the outcome that loss to follow-up or administrative end follow-up. And with our emulation, this was defined as January 1998, when people had returned their dietary questionnaire, and additional considerations for how loss to follow-up was defined. And the outcome of interest was the 22-year risk of heart failure. So again, this framework is helping us clarifying who are we intervening on, when is the starting point of our intervention, the duration of this dietary intervention, and the follow-up period. Now, this had to do with who's eligible, who are we studying. If we think now about the treatment strategy and what Didi was talking about, With traditional analysis, when we think about an example such as the DASH diet, what we do is we compare in traditional nutrition epidemiology people who had a low adherent score against those who have a high score. However, if we truly think about this, we could conclude that this is not a well-defined intervention. And why is that? It's because people can achieve a given score in multiple ways by achieving different goals of this DASH intervention. So if we go back to ask the same question as what we were asking with the hormone replacement therapy, like what decision would a study like this inform? It's actually really hard. Would the evidence from a traditional nutrition epidemiology analysis will tell us anything about whether we should start eating a certain way, stop eating a certain way? It's very, very hard. Now, coming to this specific example of the target trial emulation, we can see in this case that the authors had to, before emulating anything, they had to really think through what they were doing and what was the dietary strategy that they were trying to test. So as you can see here, the target trial framework is truly forcing us to specify which foods are we going to be intervening on. So this was a trial that intervened at the food level. We also need to specify either the minimum or the maximum intake of each of the foods that we want to intervene on. And something that is also very important is the comparator intervention, or who are we going to be comparing people with. So in this case, the intervention was a joint intervention. What would have happened if people follow the recommendation of an adapted DASH pattern versus maintaining their usual intake? And I think Daniel later on is going to talk about some of the complexities here with dietary data. The emulation had to be adapted to reflect what was observed in the Swedish population to actually be able to emulate this trial. But what I want to highlight here is that this framework is forcing us to really think through what we're doing and what we're what our comparison groups are. Now, when we talk about randomization, if you were to conduct this trial, you could randomize assignment to no intervention and following the joint intervention for the DASH diet. With observational data, you can't do that. So you have to assume that randomization is conditional on baseline covariates and maybe other pre-baseline covariates. So in this case, we're still assuming that we have conditional exchangeability. So that's not different from traditional analysis. However, as opposed to traditional nutrition epidemiology, what we can see here, and what I think it's important, is that dietary intake before the start of this intervention was considered a confounder. So diet prior to eligibility and the start of follow-up was taken into account. And again, this is not a methods talk by any means, so I'm not gonna go deep into what the causal contrasts are or the analysis plan and what the G formula is actually doing. I just wanna highlight the differences between a traditional analysis and what the framework is actually helping us think through. And one of the things that I want to highlight is that the causal contrast of interest was the per protocol effect, which means that we're interested in estimating a sustained strategy. So what happens if people follow the DASH diet over time instead of only asking about baseline diet? So in this case, we also need to consider changes in diet and lifestyle over time. And this framework also allows us, and if data is available, of course, to also consider any issues with treatment and confounding feedback. So how did this study compare to previous studies? So basically what they found is that compared with following the usual diet, sustained adherence to the adapted DASH diet over 20 years suggests that 0.7 and 0.9% of heart failure cases could have been prevented in this population. What's interesting here is that other prospective studies that didn't use the target trial framework and conducted the analysis in a traditional way showed very mixed results. But interestingly, and as Phoebe already showed with some of her examples, was that previous findings in the same Swedish cohorts also reported a lower rate of heart failure. But what I want to highlight this is the question was not the same, despite the similar results. So what the target trial framework can do for nutrition research, I think it's, first of all, it helps clarify the question of interest as a trial would do. And if we're thinking about what decisions we're going to make or how are we going to inform dietary guidelines in policy, if we analyze or think about our questions within the target trial framework, we can actually compare dietary strategies that can inform policy. And I guess some of you might be asking this question: how do we know that an emulation of the DASH trial will give us the same answer as a randomized trial? And the question is, we don't know. There's no long-term randomized trial comparing these treatment strategies with heart failure. And this is actually a really interesting, I think, line of research and opportunity to try to benchmark dietary trials. This is potentially going to be limited because there are very few dietary trials, but I think this is also something important to do and to be able to advance the field. And I just want to close with something that Miguel Hernan says, I don't know if all the time, but I've heard him said this multiple times, and it's if we cannot translate our causal question into a target trial, then our question is not well defined. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge everybody here and also the American Diabetes Association for funding, and I will be happy to respond to any questions if there's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. There's no, like, there aren't any questions coming up in the chat.
Or if you guys have questions.
Question.
Yeah. Or I could repeat the question. Yeah.
Excellent talk, thank you. I think the Women's Health Initiative, which is not the same as the diet trial, separate trial, run at the same time, is a really good example to motivate this. One question I had was the implications of having baseline only diet versus repeated measures, and what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, no, this is a good question, and I feel it's something we have discussed and talked about maybe Daniel, who conducted this analysis, is better equipped than I am to answer this question, but it's true. It's a challenge because the majority, or I'm from Mexico, and I work with data from the Mexican teachers cohort. And of course, we don't have repeated data. We have repeated data, but it's not as rich as other US cohorts. So this is something that we really need to think about. And it's twofold, right? First, whether we think pre-baseline diet is a confounder, yes or no, and what are the assumptions behind that? And the second one is whether we can conduct or think about emulating a target trial with a sustained dietary strategy. So from the paper that I just presented, Daniel was actually able to compare or to understand whether there was a difference in the effect estimates if you adjusted for pre-baseline diet versus if you didn't. And I hope that what I'm saying is correct. They didn't find a huge difference. And I know maybe we can conclude that adjusting for pre-baseline diet, at least in this very specific case, was not such a big deal. But I honestly cannot say that that's true for other questions of interest. So yeah, this is a challenge. And I think there are multiple opportunities to try to better understand these issues on data availability in nutrition epidemiology.
We have a question online asking if a nutrient labeling policy is on a nutrient level, what would you consider when defining the exposure? And like it gives us examples, grams or energy of sugar in labeled foods, or whole foods in diet. So yeah, it's basically asking how would you
how do we define our intervention? I know this is hard, and I know some people are gonna disagree with what I think, but I would recommend to think about the food level. I think Didi walked us through some of the issues on intervening at the nutrient or energy level. So I would stick with the food level. I believe it's a better defined intervention, but I know other people think differently.
Here I would also add that you may not need to define the level of exposure at the nutrient level, but also not at the food level. Probably you just have to target the intervention as the nutrient labeling policy. So at the just the effect of the policy labeling nutrients, not at the foods themselves. There's another question regarding sample sizes. So they are asking whether there's a minimum sample size for which is not even relevant to make a target trial emulation.
That's a good question. Yes, before trying to emulate your hypothetical trial, you need to look at your data, who's eligible, whether you can actually do this. I am not a biostatistician. I don't know the answer to the question. Like if you might be able to do it even with small samples. The question here is your confidence intervals. If it's too small to be able to actually inform anything, then maybe it's not worth it. But as a power calculation, well, I think that's not advised, like doing power calculations for analysis of observational data, but yeah, it would be important to see whether it is feasible to conduct your hypothetical trial with the data that you have. That's for sure.
So I think it's time to move with the next speaker. And this is Octavio.
So, hi everyone. Nice having you all here and those online as well. Thank you for providing us this space to present our ideas and questions. And also, this is more of a educational for both sides. We're also working on this actively and trying to find answers to these difficult questions within the field of diets and dietary exposures. My talk is on dietary exposures as compound treatments. And I changed the title because I thought that it was a little bit selfish of me presenting a problem and not providing a solution, which is this proposal of using threshold interventions as a potential way of solving our questions, which I'll delineate. I'm also a part of this American Diabetes Association grant, working with Deirde Tobias, Dalia Stern, and unfortunately not here, Martin Lajou, who both of them work in Mexico. Again, I will present the causal question because as we've all been discussing, as you'll continue discussing, is that first we have to define the question precisely with all its components, and only until we have this well-proposed question can we start defining our methods for this answering. Obviously, I'll discuss the traditional approaches and how would we design a hypothetical intervention using threshold interventions, and very briefly the implementation. There's different questions and different types of questions, broadly speaking. Thresholds are only a way of defining how we are interested in our exposure to behave within the population. But we can think of them as very public health relevant, given that that's how we dietary guidelines present our questions. Do we eat more or less than 5 fruits or vegetables per day? Should we eat red meat daily or even weekly or not at all? But it all based on a cut point that is potentially informed by these observational studies, which we've been discussing have some complications in and of itself. But it's also if we add this food to our usual diet or we're substituting it for something else. But now I'll center around this question, which I'll be discussing throughout the entire talk, and what is the effect of recommending a consumption of at least 5 servings a day of fruits and vegetables, which I will from now on present as FFV, and the effect is on all-cause mortality in the general population. So compound treatments occur whenever we have a continuous variable, consumption of fruits and vegetables, and we decide to categorize it because, as we have mentioned, our question is based on a threshold, the threshold of eating more or less than 5 servings per day. But we can also conduct this in a different way when we have a different question, maybe if we are considered above or below the median, which would be those consuming within our sample higher or lower quantities of whatever exposure we want to define, and maybe the typical approach, which is the quantile approach of whatever we decide, how many categories, either 1 or 3 or 5 categories of exposure. So this is just how would we do it in a quantile approach of, in this case, quintiles. This is the information from the Nurses' Health Study, who were actually looking at the question I proposed previously, which is the effect of fruits and vegetable consumption within the nurses and health professionals follow-up study. What I want to point out is that within these categories, there's different levels of exposure or different quantities that these groups are consuming, where we have a quintile, first quintile of a medium serving of 2 servings, 2.1 servings. The opposite, the top quintile is consuming 7 servings. And overall, we can see that they're comparable, meaning that they're really similar in consumptions, but this underlying consumption is what we're interested in now. The traditional approach might tell us to just apply this threshold, dichotomize those above or below this level of consumption, but this has different implications when we're trying to give the specific give the specific results on defining a comparator, what often happens is that this categorization loses information and variability within our study. Perhaps to the right, you see the nurses' health study, as I mentioned before. But if we applied the same categorization to different populations, the number of actual servings consumed by these people might be different. Whereas in the Stefan study and also conducted in the US, the categories are basically similar. In a cohort of Finnish participants, we see that even the top category does not consume the same amount of fruits and vegetables per day as the US cohorts. So what we want to define specifically is not only the quantity, but perhaps it's also important to define what's the type of fruits and vegetables, because it's not just the effect of maybe it's not just the quantity, but what we understand from eating fruits and vegetables. Maybe we tend for ones more than the other. So what is the problems with our traditional approach? Perhaps this dichotomization, as I mentioned, takes away this additional information that is necessary for understanding the effects. However, I would also like to add that perhaps we want to sustain this intervention over time and updating these dietary index over time. But again, this is a different question from the one we were parting from the beginning, and additional issues that are not specifically for observational studies, but in general that are relevant for our analysis that we have to consider, and if we decide to implement a target trial, would be necessary to address. So back to our question of fruits and vegetable intake, we decided to categorize these people above or consuming less than fruits and vegetables, which I again mentioned as categorization as a dichotomous variable, but this does not actually reflect the actual intake, which I now define as AFV. But why is that? Because, for example, if we were exposed to this article to the right, maybe we understand differently what fruits and vegetable intake means. Maybe culturally, there's differences that make us decide to eat a certain type of fruit, certain type of vegetable more, maybe the quantities as well. But it's also other factors, external factors, that will determine what type of actual version of the treatment we will take. I will briefly describe the figure, the direct acyclic graph you see here. And the idea here is to present the causal structure of our question, where we're interested in the dichotomization of fruit and vegetable intake, which is the node in green, the little green bubble in the center. But this relates to the actual fruit and vegetable consumption, which can be actually a result of these different factors of defining what is the actual intake when we are exposed to this message over here to the right. And the idea here is to present not only in this tag, where we're also pointing out is that there's different confounders to this causal relationship, which we summarize with L, which are measured confounders, or U, which are unmeasured confounders. But we're interested on their effect on death or mortality in the general population, as we mentioned before. But again, this FV node actually just represents the category we're defining people in, when in reality, we're interested in the effect of the actual consumption of fruits and vegetables. Let's also not forget that as Professor Tobias was mentioning, these fruits and vegetables are different among cultures, and we even have differences within the amount of nutrients within these exposures, such as the difference in levels of vitamin E, fiber, beta carotenes, and also the different versions that result from us cooking our foods differently or consuming them with others accompanying dishes. And let us not forget that this also takes into place, comes into play with the different types of patterns that we consume our foods. Maybe we decide for a plant-based food pattern, which would entail a little more consumption of fruits and vegetables. And this is also important to consider, not only for defining our question better, but also to making sure that we're actually finding the effect that we're looking for. So why is the compound data so detrimental for defining or identifying our estimate? Why is it so why so impactful? The idea here being that one of the among the various assumptions that we're doing with these causal inference questions is one of them is the consistency assumption, which basically means that the expected outcome of a certain intervention, in this case, consuming more than 5 fruits and vegetables per day, is actually the outcome that we would expect of a person consuming this level of intake. This might seem a little simplistic, very obvious. However, when we use compound information, compositional data, what happens is that our outcome is now the effect of consuming this, being in a category that is higher or lower than 5 fruits and vegetables, but also our specific level of treatment. Meaning, I personally decide to eat 6 servings of fruits and vegetables, whereas someone else decides to eat 7 or 8. And this difference in our levels of intake will result in perhaps inconsistencies of the outcome. What do I mean by this? Because what I mean by this is that perhaps the particular risk of a particular version of the treatment is not resulting in the outcome that we expect. For example, in the bottom in purple, it would be, what if we were assigned to eating no fruits and vegetables, or we did not consume fruits and vegetables? Based on this categorization, we have people who actually don't consume fruits and vegetables, and also those who consume 4 servings per day. So in reality, these 2 individuals might be having a different effect, and we must not forget that this is relevant for our analysis more than just the consumption of the categorization, the dichotomization. So in order to design our hypothetical intervention trial, again, we go back to the question of the effect of 5 or more servings per day of fruits and vegetables. And the idea here being that we can design an intervention based on this threshold, where we not only take, as you see in the, what I present here is an example of how 4 different people might behave within our trial, or within our hypothetical trial, where their actual fruit and vegetable intake might be, for the first individual, of 6, the second of 2, or the third of 5, and the final of 3. We categorize them as you would normally do, individuals consuming above or below the recommended levels, and finally maintaining this information, retaining the information of consuming 6, 2, 5, or 3 fruits and vegetables per day. The idea being here that this is the actual leading the actual effect, and not our dichotomization of the exposure or our continuous variable, which and just for those what is the contrast here? Because we're contrasting those who we want a specific contrast. It's not here we're specifying for those that actually consume more than 5 fruits and vegetables. We're going to assign them to a consumption of 0, meaning that going from 6 servings of fruits and vegetables per day for the first individual, this would be taken down to 0, whereas for the second, this would be taken up to a consumption of 5, which is our threshold or level of intervention that we are considering to be relevant for public health. And what does this mean that we include both the categorization and the actual treatment? Meaning that what we're actually doing is including both of these variables within our model, and the idea being here that one of them is actually driving the effect, and the other is more or less what the intention was for that person in a particular day. Maybe they were assigned to a category of 0, and they actually consumed 3 servings of fruits and vegetables. We will leave it as such, and the idea is here that even though our intention does not align our observed outcome. The idea here being that the only node driving the effect is the actual intake and not our intentions. And finally, I want to present some examples on some of these threshold interventions applied to some of the studies that some of the researchers in this group have conducted. This was a study by Professor Martin Lajous on fish consumption and risk of coronary heart disease, and he was interested in the effect of hypothetical interventions of consuming no servings per day of fish, consuming at least 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 5, but also as specific as to substituting these for consumption of red fish, of red meat instead of red meat consuming fish. The idea was here to find the coronary heart disease risk over 18 years, and this was conducted in the nurses and health professionals follow-up studies. And as you can see, I'm presenting here some of his results. You see the different interventions and the intervention proportions, meaning that within every follow-up or within this group of people, what we see is that 100% of interventions were delivered to those who were assigned to consuming 0 servings of fish per week. This is that overall there was some consumption over the period, and overall over the whole study, at some point everyone was intervened on because they were consuming at least some amount of fish. Whereas those, and similar to those consuming more than 5 servings per day, meaning that these were very, very strict, very intensive interventions that led to practically everyone within this hypothetical trial being intervened on at some point, and similar to those in the meat replacement for meat replacement. But what I want to highlight is the results of the actual substitution and the actual results, which is what we see is that from the no intervention, meaning everyone consuming their usual intake of fish, there was a 3.9 risk of coronary heart disease. And this, when we told everyone, or hypothetically told everyone to consume an amount of 0 serving of fish per week, this resulted in a higher risk of coronary heart disease. And as we include or more servings of fish in our diet or in this hypothetical intervention, what we saw is that this risk was even lower, which maximized at 3 servings per week, which is highly coincides with our knowledge of and recommendations of fish intake. And similar results were found when fish was substituted for fish and when red meat was substituted for fish. Now, these hypothetical interventions were also conducted, or can be conducted in other contexts as well. And these threshold interventions can be applied to other exposures, and not just nutritional interventions. We could also think of exercising or avoiding smoking, or a certain amount of smoking and per day. And what I mean by this, or I want to present here, is that that we can do not only a simple intervention of focusing on one of these items, fruits and vegetables, but we could also extend this to applying multiple interventions at a time, all of these with different thresholds. So maybe we want people to exercise 30 minutes per week, minutes per day, while they're also consuming 5 servings of fruits and vegetables, but also maintaining perhaps a reduced BMI, or a BMI under 25. And overall, what we see here is the similar effects, or similar conditions, where the more strict our interventions are, the more people have to be intervened on, because the criteria are so elevated. And to finalize, what we see is that the threshold interventions and compound treatments, compound exposures are questions regarding the minimum or maximum consumption of whatever food item that we're considering. And often standard methods introduce bias due to this difference in what's driving the effect and how we are categorizing it, or how we are deciding to analyze it. and that these threshold interventions provide an alternative to answer our questions with reasonable assumptions, obviously taking into consideration the basics of no unmeasured confounding and no measurement error, which are also big issues that we have to address within our analysis, and the target trial framework that Dalia has already explained. Thank you.
I don't know if you can hear me online when I talk on this microphone, so I'll just here.
Yeah, and so so Bodies is asking whether there's an entry-level paper on introduction to DAX relevant for nutrition research.
Relevant for nutrition research specifically, I don't think there's something that we can in the group recommend, but I think any causal DAG, there's many readings online that we can they can send you. Perhaps give us contact any of us and we can send you some links. But yeah, I think that's better than just. One of our colleagues is mentioning to perhaps refer to Peter Tennant from the University of Leeds, and he has also a course on this and compositional data specific for nutrition.
So we don't have any more questions. Do we have any questions here? Yeah.
So
We break. Yeah. So, well, I hope you enjoyed this first part of the session today. We will have a small break until 2 p.m. and then be back for transportability and review. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We're going to start with our next speaker is Conor Macdonald, and he's going to be talking about the validity of meta-analysis in nutrition epidemiology. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. As I said, I'm Conor from Karolinska Institute in Sweden. Yeah, the title is slightly different than the schedule, so my apologies to the organizers for that mix-up, but hey-ho. So yeah, thanks for having me, and let's kick off the second half. So back to eggs. I wanted to use eggs again today as my example, because for some reason, the newspapers and the media outlets love to pick up studies on eggs. And it's understandable because, as we saw earlier, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Oh no. In the estimates from meta-analysis. So there should be a lovely figure there that Deirde showed before, basically showing that we cannot decide if egg intake is good or bad. So we're having a bit of technical issues here. I think we should just pause and check that the rest of the slides look okay.
Yeah. Was it like animated?
No, it was a PDF. It was a PDF. Yeah. Is it just this slide that's causing problems?
They look okay.
Okay. Yeah, we'll just go ahead and assume that, hope that the rest of the slides look fine. So this should have showed the forest plot from the meta-analysis that Deirde showed earlier. So thankfully, we've already seen that. But basically to say is that when we look at these studies, we seem to be unable to come to the conclusion, are eggs good or are eggs bad? So what I want to speak about in this talk is, why is that the case? So as such, I'm going to split this talk into kind of two parts. First, we'll ask, why are these results so heterogeneous? What are some potential causes of that heterogeneity? And then after, what is the implication of that when we actually do a meta-analysis and try to use the estimates from a meta-analysis? So as we previously mentioned, like one obvious answer might be that there's unmeasured confounding. We are quite quick to say in our own studies that this is a possibility. Quite often we'll say that people with higher egg intake are less healthy, and kind of preemptively counter that by saying, yeah, maybe I'm not unmeasured confounding. But on the other side, these are data-rich cohort studies, and we're able to account for many, many potentially confounding factors. So for a moment, let's assume that that heterogeneity is maybe not caused by unmeasured confounding. The other thing in nutritional epidemiology we hear a lot about is measurement error. So could it be that measurement error is the culprit for a lot of that heterogeneity? Maybe, but let's counter that by saying most of these studies are using the same measurement tool, typically a food frequency questionnaire. And researchers have really put a lot of effort into validating these tools, and we seem to be quite confident that we're actually getting a valid measure of diet. So again, let's say that perhaps this is not the reason or the main reason for all of this heterogeneity. And going back to the previous talk, we could ask, is an egg an egg? So could it be that we've got different versions of the same treatment? So saying like, is it because different people or different countries or different study populations are eating different types of eggs? Maybe there could be some variation between majority consumption of boiled eggs versus fried eggs versus omelets or scrambled eggs, whatever. But really, is that going to be causing such disagreement? I think probably not. So let's, again, put this one to the side for now. So I would like to raise the idea that there's some other reasons that there may be a lot of heterogeneity in these studies. And these are including, but not limited to, differences in the characteristics of the study populations and differences in the statistical analysis that we do as researchers. So we often say in these research papers as well that we don't expect these results to generalize, to be applicable to other populations. But why not? So when we think about it this way, we can turn this into a question of external validity. And over the last decade, 15 years, advances in understanding of causal inference methods have given us the language to speak about this external validity problem a bit more formally. So what do we mean by external validity? I really like this definition, coming from a paper of Daniel Westreich in 2019, I think, that an effect estimate from one study is externally valid in another population if the true effect is equal, the true effect in the study is equal to the true effect in the other population. So again, already using this language to kind of understand a bit better what we mean by the generalizability of these studies. So for a study to be externally valid, it must first of all satisfy some criteria. The first and maybe the most important is that it should be internally valid. That's to say that the study result shouldn't be driven by unmeasured confounding. It's a big ask in observational studies, and we all know this, so let's just skip over that one. There are other reasons that the studies might disagree, or to flip it on its head, there are some reasons that we might expect different studies to agree. And we might expect different studies to agree, different studies asking the same question to agree, if there is consistency in the distribution of interventions or exposure versions between the study populations, and if both populations have the same distribution of effect modifying characteristics for that exposure. So for the rest of this talk, I'd like to focus on this first criteria. So that there is consistency in the distribution of interventions or exposure versions between populations. So what does that mean for egg intake? So what does that mean for egg intake? That depends on the question that we're asking. Some people might call the causal estimand, the other constituents of the diet in our study population, or other people might call the background diet, and how we analyze the data. So I want to use a kind of simple thought experiment now. Suppose that we plan on conducting some intervention on egg intake to reduce cardiovascular disease risk in two populations, in two separate populations. So we're going to do one study in France and one study in Sweden. Coincidentally, two countries that I've lived in. So the first step in this hypothetical intervention is that we would collect some baseline dietary information, baseline dietary data from these populations. So what we see is in France, people are consuming on average half an egg a day, 2.5 servings of red meat per day, and 3.5 servings of vegetables a day. Whereas in Sweden, egg intake is higher at 1.5 egg per day, but red meat and vegetable intake are both lower. And let's pretend that these are the only foods that people eat in these populations. So it's a strange intervention. We're going to increase egg intake up to two eggs per day in an attempt to reduce cardiovascular disease risk. But maybe not that strange when we've already mentioned that we don't know if eggs are good or bad. So what happens when we try and do that intervention? Well, obviously, in France, we need to increase the egg intake by 1.5 eggs per day. Again, sorry, we've got some technical difficulties on that slide again.
Yeah, I'll pause it here, and now you can just slides from here. Yeah, and
okay, so I'll use this computer.
Yeah. Let's check if you can
Okay, thank you. High tech. So if we consider this intervention that is increasing egg intake up to 2 eggs per day in both populations. So obviously in France, that requires a bigger increase in egg intake than it does in Sweden. And this is important because if we think, or if we know that the size of that increase, also called the dose response of the food on the disease, is important for the outcome, we're going to have to estimate different effectivenesses of that intervention in each population. So yeah, different versions of the intervention in each population, meaning that we might not expect these 2 studies to agree. So we can make that intervention slightly more complex. We can impose some restriction on how much food people are eating. So we can make this an isocaloric intervention as well. So there we would say, increase egg intake up to 2 eggs per day, but maintain your total energy at its usual level. So what happens there is we've got the same increases in egg intake, but obviously the other 2 foods need to decrease. And what we see again is that they decrease by different amounts in either population. And we're back to the same thing. If the effect on the outcome depends on the absolute changes of the dose response of all these foods, we've got even more reason to believe that these 2 studies will come to not the same conclusion. Maybe overall conclusion, but different effect estimates. Again, yeah, different versions of the intervention in these 2 populations, despite asking very similar question. And obviously, the real world is even more complex. We eat far more foods. And there's far more different changes we can make. So the way I think about that, that's something that's inherent to each population. You know, like we can't change the fact that different populations eat as they do. But as researchers, we can change how we analyze data, right? So it's become quite well accepted that certain analysis decisions can change the research question that we're asking. And we don't always realize that we're doing that. So in particular, probably the most well-known example is the example of adjusting on total energy intake in observational studies. And that's essentially analogously changing us from the first scenario to the second scenario. Also, what we see a lot is adjusting on other foods or other dietary components, and that changes us to something with even more restrictions. So for example, we can think of, in this case, adjusting on red meat intake would give us an intervention that says something like increase egg intake to 2 eggs per day, but maintain total energy intake and red meat intake fixed in each population. So again, different versions of the treatment happening in each one of these cases. So up until now, it's kind of the first half of the talk. We've come up with some other reasons that the same question in 2 different populations may estimate different effects. And that's mainly due to differences in the intervention or exposure versions. Additionally, we can introduce this kind of heterogeneity ourselves by our statistical adjustments. And we don't always realize that we're doing that when we adjust on total energy intake or other foods. And these things together can give us a lot of heterogeneity when we compare similar studies. So again, finally, we can see this plot again. When we start thinking about it that way, maybe it's not so surprising that all these studies do not agree. So the second part of this talk, I'm going to go back to the meta-analysis and think, what does this mean when we try and do a meta-analysis or interpret a meta-analysis or try to use a meta-analysis to inform some decision? So to me, this raises some very important questions when we think about these evidence synthesis, systematic reviews, and meta-analysis. Mainly, to who are the results relevant? How should we interpret these estimates? And maybe a more philosophical question for the end, when these estimates are so different in interpretation should they really be pooled in the first place? But first I was thinking, how do we actually do meta-analysis typically? And often the way we start is we start with quite an ambiguous question, such as what is the association between egg intake and cardiovascular disease? So we've already had a bit of discussion about how this might not be the best definition of a question. But these ambiguous questions lead into kind of ambiguous search strategies. And these search strategies don't take into account these population level differences. So when we perform a systematic review like this, we capture all these different versions of the same exposure, which again is going to make things complicated. So this becomes a problem when we want to use the estimate from a meta-analysis to inform a decision in a specific population, right? So another small fun thought experiment is that we can imagine we're happily living in Sweden, working for the public sector, no, ideal. And we've been asked to make some recommendation on egg intake for the Swedish national dietary guidelines. And to do that, obviously, what are we going to do? We're going to turn to meta-analysis. And it's not going to be straightforward to use these meta-analysis to guide our decision in Sweden, right? That's because the pooled estimates from the meta-analysis are now an average of all these different versions of the exposure or the intervention in the primary studies. And what's that? That's going to cause, well, the estimate from the meta-analysis is likely to be an over or under representation, or an over or under estimate of the estimate we would expect in our specific population, right? So that means these meta-analysis estimates are really of limited relevance to any one specific population. So it's worth thinking, what can we as researchers do to improve this situation? So the way I see it, I'm going to introduce some fruit puns here now as well. There's some low-hanging fruit, which are mainly improvements in the primary studies. That is, we can make it easier as researchers doing these primary studies for those researchers who are doing meta-analysis. So this involves things like clarifying the research questions that we're asking in the primary studies, using better definitions and better reporting of the exposures or interventions in our primary studies, and using appropriate and reporting transparently any statistical adjustments that might change the research question, and really being aware that when we adjust on these compositional data elements, that we might actually be quite drastically changing the question that we're asking. It's also some fruit that's harder to reach, I think, and this is requiring ourselves to do meta-analysis with a bit more rigor, so improving the conduct of meta-analysis in nutrition. One thing I think is obvious is that our search strategies must capture the exposure or the intervention more precisely. So we've got the PICO guidelines: population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. There's an intervention and a comparison in these guidelines. So we really need to be focusing on that. When we are synthesizing the evidence, so in the review stage, we could be asking ourselves questions like, can our search strategies be made narrower to pick up more comparable studies? Are the studies that I've identified too different to really be pooled to provide actionable information? And when we are pooling these studies, have they analyzed the data in the same way? Because as we've seen, that's going to be very important. So a bit of a caveat to this talk as well. I've spoken a lot about interventions, but we all know that in nutritional epidemiology at the moment, this is not really how we're doing things. We're using quantile groups or substitution models and such. But I hope that thinking about things in this way and using this language is still useful for people, and we can take that back to these studies and understand how it's more complicated given that the research is done in a less structured way. So yeah, just to conclude, similar studies, so studies asking similar questions in nutritional epidemiology might not agree. That's okay, because as we've seen, what looks like similar studies might actually be comparing fairly different interventions or exposures, and the study design decisions that we make can change the question that we're asking, and we might not always realize that that's happening. And we might not expect all these studies to agree, and I think that's okay. But if we don't consider these differences in studies and how these studies are done, and we want to use the meta-analysis to inform decisions in any population, that creates problems, because these pooled estimates might not actually be very relevant for any of our specific populations. And to improve this situation, we could report better, we can improve the primary research, and we can also improve the conduct of meta-analysis, primarily with stricter searching and inclusion criteria, and just awareness and consideration of these issues, and accepting the fact that these studies might not agree. To finish up with a motivational quote that is very difficult to do meta-analysis, and really we have the job of comparing apples and oranges when we do them, and yeah, it's hard work, so keep going. And thank you. So thanks to everyone here for listening to me. Thanks to some great colleagues and the people who've organized this event. And we've got time for some questions, I think.
Thank you. I don't know if we have any questions in the chat. Okay, so someone's asking, has there been any estimation of the proportion of variation or heterogeneity in meta-analysis that may arise from the failure to standardize different metrics? Or like for example, odds ratios, hazard ratios, relative risks to a common.
Yeah, that's a super nice question. So just in case people didn't hear, the question was, has there been an attempt to account for differences in the contrasts that are being made? So rather than just assuming that everything is reported in risk difference, if we've got a mixture of risk difference, hazard ratio, odds ratios, not as far as I'm aware of, but that would be another reason that we might expect heterogeneity. Yeah, if we're attempting to approximate an odds ratio as a risk ratio and then pooling as risk ratios. Yeah, super interesting idea that I hadn't actually thought of as well. So thanks for mentioning that. But no, I don't think there's been any attempt to quantify what effect that would have on the estimates. At least not in nutritional epidemiology, maybe in some other fields.
Do we have any questions in the room? If not, I have a question. Because we are conducting, we are conducting this study where we have the hypothesis that some of this heterogeneity is coming from different energy adjustment strategies. So basically, whether studies adjusted for total energy, and if they included any other dietary related variables. So I would like to hear your thoughts on whether you would expect this to make a huge difference in reducing the heterogeneity, just differentiating from adjusting for energy or not, and yeah, should we be focusing on maybe differentiating by geographical area instead? Would this reduce more the heterogeneity in size, magnitude?
Yeah, okay. Very, very long question that I'll try to summarize. So one part of that question was, could we stratify our kind of meta-analysis pooling by geographic location? Yeah, I think that's a nice idea, because I think, I mean, I don't have any evidence for this, but it seems sensible to me that similar populations will eat more similarly. So that could be one way. Yeah, saying what's the one improvement could be thinking of the meta-analysis in terms of egg intake amongst North American men would already be a bit more specific and would hopefully reduce some of that heterogeneity from different background substitutions, if you like, than including like France, Sweden, North America, Great Britain, Spain altogether, you know, where eggs are just very different parts of the diet. So yeah, I think that's one potential solution. Yeah, Deirdre, question?
Question, Natalie, reminded me of the pure cohort studies that looked at similarly collected data in a number of countries, and investigators are analyzing them all at country level and then pooling them as meta-analyses usually. But for some of those diet disease relationships, we published on many, you can see there are quite striking differences geographically for the same specifically defined exposure to food, but lacking the contrast of, you know, this versus that, where you can kind of pick out that there must be some differences potentially in the background diets, explaining why, even though it's harmonized in terms of data collection and analyses, there's still so much heterogeneity. So that might be a hint at and quantifying that.
Yeah, yeah. And should we be pooling just such different interventions? You know, it's a nice question. There's one more question in the chat, so I take that one. If the exposure only includes a few foods, how do we bring in other foods to be closer to the reality of the true diet? Does adjusting for multiple food variables help? So to me, the adjusting for multiple other foods, I think about it in terms of this adding restrictions onto that intervention. And that depends on, is that relevant for your research question? Are you really wanting to substitute that to really isolate two dietary components only and keep everything else the same? Or since you've mentioned the reality of the true diet, I think if you want to allow for flexibility in the way that meals might change in a kind of efficacy versus efficiency, effectiveness kind of language, which is controversial, you might not want to adjust for those foods, because obviously they might change if a population phases out red meat, or they might stop eating something altogether they often eat with red meat. Can't think of examples to that, but potatoes, yeah. Yeah. So yeah, again, I think this all depends on the research question you're asking and how specific you've made it. Obviously, the more specific, the better, because it tells you what to do in a way, having a very specific research question, you know.
Thanks, Conor, for your presentation. And now we're going to have speakers who are going to present some work in progress. So our first speaker is Yi Zhao. She's going to talk about a target trial emulation using a dietary intervention. Whoops. Sorry. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for the introduction, Dalia. My name is Yi Zhao. I am a doctoral student from Tufts University. And today, my presentation is about an application of target trial emulation to investigate the long-term impact of long-term fish consumption on Alzheimer's disease risk. So dementia is considered the 7th leading cause of death worldwide, according to WHO. And about 70% of dementia is categorized as Alzheimer's disease. And globally, this disease has cost us $1.3 trillion in 2019. And unfortunately, there is no really effective treatment at large scale. And oily fish, which is rich in DHA and EPA, has shown potential neuroprotective effect on the disease. However, the epidemiologic evidence for that is pretty conflicting. In the random control trials, most studies found non-effect. Well, despite that, this is considered a gold standard to derive causation. The generalizability of the random control trial also is compromised by some short-term duration, the use of surrogate outcomes. It's focused on the more higher risk population, as well as use of different interventions. In the case of diet, it is the trials on dietary supplements mostly. On the other hand, the observational studies have mostly shown protective effect of fish consumption. And as epidemiologists, we all know that the observational analysis is criticized for its confounding bias, ill-defined exposures, and sometimes reverse causation. So the objective of my study today is to estimate the effect of sustained fish intake on 23-year risk of Alzheimer's disease among group of cognitively healthy adults by emulating a hypothetical random control trial using the observational data. And the observational data I'm using is the Framingham Heart Study Offspring cohort. This cohort began in 1971, recruited about 5,000 people aged 5 to 70 years. And by 2018, there have been 9 clinical exams conducted and published. And in each of the exams, there are consistent and repeated measure of diet, lifestyle, intermediate diagnosis, such as diabetes, hypertension for every 4 years, as well as consistent long-term surveillance for Alzheimer's disease. So in the next few slides, I will review the following 7 design components side by side between the target trial and the emulation. And this list has been presented by my colleague previously. So the first step is for the eligibility criteria for the trial, we would like to recruit people who are older than 50 years old and not consuming a vegetarian diet. And at the baseline, they should not have any mild cognitive impairment or AD diagnosis. They should also not have prior conditions where cognitive impairment may be a consequence, such as stroke and head injury. To translate this criteria into the emulation, most of the criteria are the same, except that we would additionally require the participant to have complete and valid data on the diet and covariates at baseline to make sure they are present at a baseline. And it is very common that some of the measurements are just not included in the observational data sets. In our case, it's the head injury that's not measured in the Framingham data set. And in terms of the treatment, each participant will be assigned to one of the 10 intervention strategies on their fish intake. The first would be the control group, that is no intervention. Everyone would keep their usual fish intake. And the second group would be the no fish intake. Everyone consumes 0 servings per week. And the third group of intervention is, as mentioned, the threshold intervention specifically on fish. For example, if the participant is recommended to eat at least 1 serving of fish every day, then for people, every week. So for people who already have more than 1 serving, they are instructed to not to change their diet. But for people who eat less than 1 serving, they will be instructed to eat 1 serving precisely. And the last category of the intervention is the substitution intervention, where we use fish to replace the red meat intake to achieve the same threshold. So example would be if we want the participant to eat 4 servings of fish per week and they only eat 3 servings, then we would ask them to reduce their red meat intake by 1 serving and increase their fish intake by 1 serving to achieve the threshold. And the intervention in the emulation would be the same with additional assumption because we are using the food frequency questionnaire to emulate the trial. And in terms of randomization in the trial, it's just the traditional randomized assignment. And in the emulation, in order to emulate the randomization, we will adjust for the baseline covariates such as the socioeconomic status, lifestyle, diet quality, as well as the pre-baseline diet, and so on. And the outcome we are interested in both is the 23-year Alzheimer's disease risk. And the follow-up in the trial is also traditional follow-up, start at the baseline and end at the AD diagnosis, death, other dementia diagnosis, incomplete follow-up, or 23-year from the baseline, whichever occurs first. And for the emulation, we just need to additionally define what does it mean for what is it for incomplete follow-up. That is the questionnaire non-response or incomplete response for the dietary questions. And in the emulation, we also need to specify the baseline as the date of return, the second food frequency questionnaire, because we want to use the information from the first one as to adjust for the pre-baseline diet. In terms of the causal contrast, in the target trial, we are able to estimate both the intent to treat effects, that is the effect of randomized assignment to each of the treatment compared with the control group, as well as the protocol analysis, that is the causal effect among people who actually follow the intervention protocol. On the other hand, in the emulation, because we are more interested in the sustained fish intake over the follow-up, and we also allow people to censor and deviate from the protocol under certain conditions. So we will only estimate the per protocol analysis. And to estimate the per protocol analysis, we will apply for the G formula. And this is just a brief introduction for G formula for someone may not be familiar with it. It is a generalized method of standardization, and it allows us to estimate the risk of the outcome under each intervention strategy as the weighted average of the outcome risk given the past covariate history. And the weights are the distribution of the time varying covariates. And we will use the non-parametric bootstrapping for to get the 95% confidence interval. And the result, we can interpret the G formula in the setting of our study as the risk of the 23-year risk of Alzheimer's disease would have been observed if everyone in this population had followed the specific fish intake strategy. So after imposing the inclusion criteria, we have about 2,000 participants included with an average age of 31 years. And at the baseline, their fish intake is on average 1.9 servings per week. And the red meat consumption is about 4.8 servings per week. And over the follow-up, there were 89 people developed Alzheimer's disease. So this is the result for the from the G formula. And as we can see, the second column here is the marginal risk of Alzheimer's disease if everyone in the population had adhered to each of the intervention strategy. Right? And then the third column we estimate the risk ratio and comparing each strategy with the non-intervention group on the first row. And we found that if we eliminate fish consumption from diet in this population, the Alzheimer's disease risk increased by about 1.1 times. However, we didn't find any change in the Alzheimer's disease risk with the rest of intervention groups. And the last column here represents the average percentage of population we need to intervene on in order to meet the specific dietary strategy. So given that the average intake is about 2 servings per week at baseline, it is very obvious that the higher the fish intake intervention, the more people we need to intervene on hypothetically. It also means that the estimates of the higher fish intake are based on some extrapolations from few data points, that's resulting in a relatively less precise estimate, as you can see from the wide confidence interval in the risk ratio in this case. So in order to conduct a G-formula, we made several assumptions. One is the model no model misspecification. So in order to test this assumption, there are several ways. One way is to compare the predicted AD risk using the G-formula under the usual fish intake, that is no intervention, with the real data, the observed AD risk. And we can also verify that for our time models for time-varying covariates. Another way to test for model misspecification is to model the covariates using the different functional forms. And this is a figure that compares the estimated AD risk with the observed risk. And as you can see, they are fairly overlapped, which means the risk of model misspecification should be relatively low. And another assumptions we made is the lack of confounding bias. This is my future step for this project. So there are also multiple ways to do that. One way is to use the positive or negative outcome control. The second, we can also adjust for additional covariates such as supplement use, physical exam, and cancer screening to see the robustness of the result. We can also adjust for time-varying covariates one exam before the data was collected. So these are several limitations for this project. As mentioned before, due to the small number of AD cases, as well as small number of people with high fish intake, some of the result estimations have low precision. And for future improvement, I am thinking about using observational data sets with a large number of outcomes ascertained. And when designing the hypothetical intervention, we'll have the background diet of this population in mind to design a more practical intervention with more policy implications. And another small limitation is that they're actually embedded inherently some different versions of treatment, because we cannot really distinguish fish with low versus high mercury levels from the current FFQ, and we know that mercury may have negative effect on cognitive performance. So a better defined research question and intervention, if data allowed, is to ask what is the effect of sustained fish intake with low mercury levels. So in conclusion, in this study of cognitively healthy older adults, we found that eliminating fish from their diet over 23 years increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease. However, increased fish intake or replacing red meat with fish up to 4 servings per week did not really reduce the AD risk. So this is my reference and my acknowledgement to the CIN working group, as well as my doctoral committee. Thank you.
This was a very nice presentation. We have a couple of questions in the chat. One related to your study population and the other related to the covariate selection strategy. So the first one is asking, could you tell us more about the study population? Are they offspring of participants of the initial Framingham cohort? If this is the case, of which population are these representative? I am trying to imagine the way we go from your data to the target population. So to whom these results would apply.
Yeah, so this is the offspring of the original Framingham study, and as well as the spouse of the offspring. So the this population is a group of majority of white population live in the Massachusetts. And in terms of the generability, we can use the transportability method, hopefully to extend this inference to the larger population.
Thank you. And the other question says, in the emulation of randomization through covariate adjustment, how were the covariates selected?
I think the selection of the covariates was not that different from the selection when we do the traditional regression analysis. It's a mix of domain knowledge as well as some data-driven methods, such as variable selection. But I would say the domain knowledge play an important role. I needed experts in dementia and diet to help me to go through the process. And also, just to add on that, it's never going to be perfect. The target triangulation is not aimed to eliminate the confounding bias. That's why we would like to conduct more sensitivity analysis at the end to test out the robustness of our study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yi, for your presentation. It was a very nice presentation. And now I would like to present again Octavio Pano, who's going to be talking about benchmarking or challenges of benchmarking the PREDIMED trial using 2 US cohorts.
Thank you. Thank you, Dalia, again, for the introduction. Yeah, again, I modified a little bit my title again because of reasons you'll see eventually during the presentation. Again, my disclosures are as follow. And I want to start perhaps taking a step back and presenting this thought experiment from ancient Greece of Theseus' ship, which for those of you who do not remember Greek mythology is an ancient legend in Greece. And Theseus was the slayer of the Minotaur and the founder of Athens. And the idea here is that the thought experiment is, if we take his ship and we try to preserve it over time, would this ship be the same ship that crossed and sailed the seas with Theseus himself? And did this ship also, by conjunction, also slay the Minotaur as Theseus did? And the idea here being that my analogy is that when we take and try to replicate the parts of a thing, then do we still have, by the end of the replication, the same components or the same item it wants to represent? Similar to what we're doing with our benchmarking. But stepping back into reality, we have different, the idea here being that a benchmark is just an attempt at reaching the same estimate from two different samples of a potentially similar population. At the top, we have an index trial, which is the trial we decide we want to conduct a benchmark against, because we consider this the gold standard, and a cohort that is by convenience, or maybe we have particular interest in this specific cohort to understand. And the idea here being that together we can probably have a better sense of the methods of an observational study, and if these approximate the same estimates as the ones in an index trial. However, this requires for us to know, among other things, that there are different reasons for which people participate in these different studies. The reasons for participating in a trial are different from those that participating in a cohort, which means that there's different probabilities of participation. Maybe in the reasons people participate in trials are to obtain these bags of goodies that we all receive when enrolling in a dietary intervention trial, whereas in a cohort, there may be other motivators. However, in order to reach the same estimate in a trial and in a cohort, we have to take a very keen knowledge or take a step back and think of all these reasons in order to identify all potential deviations in our sampling. We've been all mentioning what are the conditions under which we can identify the true causal effect of whatever question we are presenting, and repeating again that these are for the sake of a causal question. We require consistency of the outcome, conditional exchangeability for the observational studies, and we assume that this is true for a randomized experiment. But however, for the observational studies, obviously this requires the assumption that there's no unmeasured confounding, which some are more lenient on, and others, as you mentioned, has done a very good job at trying to address this issue and try to make us more certain of our conclusions. But also that we have enough people in all of the categories pertaining to treatment and confounder distributions, as well as now the participation within the cohorts. However, again, I want to reiterate that these are individually for if we want to conduct a trial or we want to conduct an emulation, we require these conditions for us to really reach a causal effect. However, for a benchmarking, the idea being that we want to reach a same estimate with both of our populations, or a combination of these populations, samples, sorry, that we require additional assumptions, being conditional exchangeability within the selection into both groups. This just means that we know the reasons why people participate in these studies, and that we have these measured to sufficient detail that we have enough information to safely say that we understand that that even though they were sampled differently, that they are comparatively equal and will yield the same result. So once we have this ideal of what we want to do, which is replicate, for example, thesis-ship, in this case, what we decided was to conduct a similar benchmarking of the PREDIMED trial, and for that we obviously try to, as best as possible, describe the protocol of its emulation, and in the end, just trying to align as much as possible all these different reasons why people participate in both studies. Just to reiterate that the PREDIMED trial is a Prevención con Dieta Mediterránea trial conducted in Spain. I'll go over these details, specifics in more detail, but they compared a Mediterranean diet intervention, either supplemented with nuts or olive oil, and compared it with a low-fat pattern intervention. So a one-on-one positive control outcome. And then the final, the primary outcome of interest was cardiovascular prevention. So this is a brief description of our protocol, how we try to think of the trial in terms of a target trial based on what the description was of the PREDIMED, and try to replicate these same characteristics in the nurses' health nurses' health study and the health professionals follow-up study. And as you can see, initially, there are quite stark differences from the get-go. We obviously don't have Spanish residents within nurses and health professionals follow-up study, and they are also health professionals, meaning that they're not really from the general or overall population. These are obviously men and women with a certain certain limits of age, which we could replicate within our target trial and our nurses' health study prevention, health professional follow-up study. And finally, other characteristics that were in the inclusion criteria for the PREDIMED, which would similarly emulate within these. Just to mention briefly that for some of these characteristics of risk factors, they actually measured these with blood samples, and these characteristics were not possible to obtain within the nurses' health study. Continuing with exclusion criteria, in this case, we focused on the specific study that observed incidence of diabetes. Therefore, we excluded prevalent diabetes cases within our target trial in an emulation within the nurses' health study, and applied similar exclusion criteria as the PREDIMED did originally, which was prevalent cardiovascular disease, any severe chronic illness. Just to reiterate that these are self-reported diagnoses within our cohorts. And however, they are very substantially validated with additional questionnaires, and therefore we expect that these are sufficiently precise enough to identify cases and non-cases of prevalent diseases. Unfortunately, there are measures that are more difficult to delineate, to determine, such as a low estimated 1-year survival, meaning that these would be patients that are very, very much sick, very much in poor condition, and would not be eligible to participate in a dietary intervention trial, and immunodeficiency or HIV status, which in this case we don't have any measure of this within our cohort. Others are more simple to emulate, such as alcoholism or having more than 80 grams a day of alcohol, and other characteristics that you will see in next. So we applied these exclusion criteria, and as we can see that there's practically similar characteristics of our sample, both in the PREDIMED and the nurses' health study, with some differences that might be more stark, such as prevalence of overweight and obesity. But in general, we could say that there's generally some alignment between both of the samples. Now, in terms of the intervention, just a brief reminder that this was a 14-item Mediterranean diet adherence screener, in which it was everyone received a score of 1 if they adhere to healthy recommendations that are in line with the Mediterranean diet, and a 0 if they did not. And additionally, the comparator, which was the low-fat diet, and in a similar categorization. Within our sample, those who are eligible to participate according to the application of the exclusion criteria, what we see is that overall there's a moderate adherence to the Mediterranean diet and low-fat patterns within both of the cohorts, which would perhaps have some difficulties in trying to estimate those who actually adhere to all points, which is something that for currently we don't have anyone in this category. And here's a description of each of these points, each of the 40 items of the Mediterranean diet. And as we can see, in pink are the nurses health study participants, and PREDIMED are in blue. And the background diets are in general equal in some aspects. Not so big a difference in the using the first columns, meaning olive oil consumption if they was used as a main fat. But for example, the consumption of fruits and vegetables was very different between both of the cohorts. However, these differences could be aligned statistically using reweighting of the samples and trying to overrepresent those who actually adhere to these recommendations, trying to replicate the PREDIMED distribution. And finally, assignment and follow-up. Again, we would try to align ourselves to the best as possible to the PREDIMED in order to reach the same answer to the same question. And although we don't have randomization, we do have conditional exchangeability if we consider all relevant covariates. And in terms of temporality and follow-up, we decided to start follow-up in 2010 in the Nurses' Health Study, trying to take advantage of pre-baseline diet questionnaires in 2006, and potentially, if our benchmark is successful, we could also estimate the effect of diabetes, incident diabetes over the next 10 years of 6 years of the Nurses' Health Study. And and finally, again, our definition of the outcome. This would be ideally measured in terms of metabolic metabolic indicators such as fasting plasma glucose. However, we rely on self-reported diagnoses, which are very well and much validated within the cohorts. And the idea here being that we're attempting an intention to treat analog of in an observational study such as the one that was conducted in the PREDIMED trial. So to conclude, I think it's safe to say that with some assumptions being unmeasured confounding, that we don't have measurement error, we can safely say that we can respond to the same question within the Nurses' Health Study, the same question that the PREDIMED trial conducted. However, for a benchmarking of the observational analysis of the PREDIMED, meaning obtaining the same estimate, maybe there's additional assumptions. These additional reasons why people participate in the trials that may result in us not successfully attaining a benchmark. Similar to the Theseus ship, we really hope that we can achieve the same results. However, perhaps thinking that if we change all these factors within a trial, then we really don't have the same estimate in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia.
We have one question in the chat related again to this randomization, and it's related. So Boris is asking, how would you explain in lay language what's the meaning of the conditional exchangeability assumption?
So this is where So the question was, how would I explain in lay language what is conditional exchangeability? So basically, in a trial, we obtain exchangeability, which is no measured confounding because of randomization. The only reason we can say that both groups are equal is because we assign the treatment randomly. This does not occur in observational studies. However, conditional exchangeability would mean that within every level of every confounder and the treatment, that we can say that that we successfully find a randomized cell. So if we did a matrix of all confounders and the treatment levels, that every cell of that matrix, people in each cell would be exchangeable, or that they would really be equal because all confounding factors are equal.
Thanks. Super nice presentation. So I've got a question that obviously relates back to my presentation. So obviously there's going to be different distributions in the how people change their diet in PREDIMED and nurses or what impact do you think that will have on the benchmarking? And have you got anything? Could we visualize that? Is there a way we can quantify this difference? I think that would be super interesting.
So yeah, thank you, Connor. Again, what would be repeating question is what would if we want to apply the same intervention, what would be the differences in perhaps how people respond to this exposure, right? The idea being here that the very easy and very executive answer is that we, because of such a short time frame that we're applying this intervention, we really can't provide, like in the 4 years, we can't really say that people had adhered similarly as they did in the PREDIMED and that we would obtain the same estimates. This is more a matter of not sufficient questionnaires to emulate a sustained intervention. But again, it would require what we've been discussing of applying of knowing information, or a sort of per protocol effect of a per protocol replicating how the PREDIMED adhere, not per protocol as the actual protocol states. So yeah, this is a very good question, and I don't know if there's a better answer to that. It's hard to conceptualize, and I think yeah, it's a good, yeah. I don't know any way better to explain it or to answer this. Yeah. Thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, Octavio. I think, yeah, you did a really good job highlighting the issues of thinking about benchmarking. Are you, I thought it was Yu-Han, I'm sorry. Okay, so now we have Natalia Ortega, and she's going to be talking about detecting unmeasured confounding with negative control exposures in nutrition.
Thank you, Dalia, for this introduction. So I think this topic fits very well with the question we just got, and I'll try to keep this very practical from very like abstract and like conceptual talks we had until now. So as my title says, I'll be focusing on detecting unmeasured confounding with negative control exposures in nutrition. So very quickly, the goal for today, for this talk, is to propose some examples with like sort of real DAGs for a quick sensitivity analysis to detect unmeasured confounding for nutritional exposures. And these will be mainly related to dairy, just because my PhD it focuses on the effect of dairy in cognitive decline in older adults. And like this is of course happening in Switzerland. And I was wondering, are the effects I'm finding due to changes in dairy, or is it that I have some unmeasured confounding due to the wine that comes together with the fondue? So just to give a quick background on what a negative control exposure is. So imagine we have this DAG here, where A is our exposure of interest, Y is our outcome of interest, U are the unmeasured confounders, and C are the measured confounders. So then Z here is this negative control exposure that's assuming that it shares the same bias structure with A, with our exposure of interest, but on the contrary, it's not directly linked to Y, right? So you can see that Y and Z are only linked through the measured and through the unmeasured confounders. There's no direct arrow between Y and Z. And for today's talk, I'm going to propose this for bias detection, but you should know that there are methods to apply this to debiasing your effect estimates. But today we will just keep it in the bias detection. So to see how this works, we have here this first equation where that we would normally apply if we were interested in knowing the effect of A on Y. We would, of course, include in our model the exposure of interest, the measured confounders, but not the U, right? Like these are unmeasured. Secondly, we will build this other model that would include A, again, the measured confounders C, and Z this time. So that if we find an effect here, so if alpha 1 is different than 0, this means that there's unmeasured confounding. Why? Because we've blocked all the paths, but if this path exists, we will find an effect here, right? Meaning that that there's like this butler path that's not blocked, and that wouldn't be blocked for A. So I guess this is clear. The case in nutritional epi, like this applies to all fields, but I argue here that sources of bias depend on the level of our hypothetical intervention, whether we are intervening in the micronutrient level, in the food or macronutrient level, or in a diet level. And we have different sources of unmeasured or residual confounding that are common and in nutritional epidemiology studies, like body size that we may have measured via BMI with like some accuracy, physical activity, metabolic efficiency. This is usually unmeasured. Other foods or nutrients, as the case in the example with wine, and preferences and behaviors. So let's keep in mind that we will need probably a different negative control exposure for each of these possible variables that we are mismeasuring or that we haven't measured at all. So today I'll focus on micronutrient and foods and macronutrient DAGs, or examples for these variables. So starting with micronutrients, I argue that we can have two parameters of interest. First, the mechanistic parameters, where we are interested in the effect of a nutrient alone without the effect of the food matrix coming with the nutrient. Or we could also intervene at the food level here in policy or recommendations, right? Where we usually don't recommend eat 100 milligrams of vitamin C, but we better say eat 1 orange a day, for example. So for that, we would be intervening through the food, but would also relate to the effect of the macronutrient, but we want to know the effect of both together, the matrix and the nutrient. So if you're interested in how to compute the first one, I'm giving a talk at SER, so attend if you're interested. But for the case of today, if we imagine that we are interested in the effect of sodium in a mechanistic way, so the effect of sodium alone without the effect of the food matrix, then we can compare total dietary sodium, and then if vitamin C had a similar correlation to total calorie intake, we could use vitamin C as our negative control exposure to represent some of these total calorie intake that may be mismeasured or totally unmeasured for some of the data we have. In this case, we would, of course, need to know how much correlation or relation is between vitamin C and sodium when it comes to total calorie intake. For a substitution or policy or recommendation type of question, I'm putting the example here of a vitamin B12, where we could be interested in the effect of milk with natural B12 and the effect of this replacement for soy milk with added B12. So we may have this doubt, normal doubt, on whether people who consume milk are exchangeable with people who consume vegetarian options, of milk substitutes. So to control for that, we could adjust for the effect of substituting full fat or skim milk, and hopefully we would get rid of all these other components and characteristics of the people consuming dairy products. Of course, we have always this strong assumption, I don't want to forget, that like this substitution is not causing anemia. And if we were interested in foods instead of micronutrients, here foods also apply to macronutrients. We can be interested in the additive effect, in the addition effect of a food for some cases, very specific, usually because as we were discussing, usually diets are isocaloric. And we can also be interested in the substitution effect. So therefore, having this explicit food replacement. So for the first type, if we were interested in recommending adding some amount of skimmed milk to the diet and seeing whether this has an effect on cardiovascular disease, again, assuming that this is not directly, that our negative control exposure is not directly related to cardiovascular disease, we could select one negative control exposure that accounted for some of the behaviors and attitudes that are characteristic of people who do consume skim milk that may be different from the rest of the population. And we could get rid of some of those if we assume that they may have similar characteristics to those who consume artificially sweetened beverages. So people who are actually looking for options to consume less calories. Another example would be related to foods but now instead of adding foods, substituting foods. If we were interested in full fat, in replacing full fat for skimmed milk, so here having the intuition that we're interested in the effect of saturated fats, and we want to again adjust for some of these common characteristics between people who do consume milk, but that is not through the effect of substituting the amount of saturated fats that you get from dairy, then we would select an option that has similar amount or content of saturated fats, and then detect whether there's some backdoor path that's unblocked. These again, of course, assuming that full fat, that the fermentation, for example, here was not affecting CVD, which could be hard to assume. So yeah, for conclusions here, this is a flexible, easy to apply method, like easy to implement whenever we have subject matter knowledge. We have to be sure that these unmeasured confounders are really the only way that we can get this effect through, that is not directly. We have a negative control outcomes that would be like similar if you don't find a plausible negative control exposure. And of course, as I've mentioned throughout, this requires additional assumptions always. So in this case, that these structures that I've shown are true, right? Which is hard sometimes. So thank you. This is work I've discussed also with Peter and Georgia, that today are not here, and also with the team present here today. So thank you.
Do we have questions in the room? So I'm going to make practical advice about using these negative control exposures.
Some practical advice for choosing them.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess that when you have a study question, you can be like, oh, if I had this variable, right? So then I would say that you can just find an exposure that would share this same relation that your exposure does share to this variable, and then try to, that's of course not related directly to the outcome, and try to have it as a negative control exposure. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Natalie. So I guess when thinking about using negative control outcomes or exposures, I feel that I usually think more about the negative control outcome.
Yeah.
And I know it's really hard to find for many of the reasons you already suggested, but like, why do you think it would be, no, if better is the right word, or easier to find negative control exposures for such a complex behavior like that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't want to claim that negative control exposures are better than negative control outcomes or anything like that. I just think that foods offer so many natural experiments, and we have so many foods that could be exchangeable and differ in some of the nutrients they contain, that if we are able to model some of these effectively, then we can just have yes, this is just trying to get a bit creative with the ways we work, and just embracing these chaos in the diet to just detect some biases in our analysis. Of course, the estimates that would come out of these wouldn't be interpretable or anything, but it can just be something easy and harmless.
In terms of a practical approach, which Conor was asking, if the confounding structure is shared between your negative exposure and your exposure of interest, would a place to start, if you maybe had some expert knowledge going in but weren't really sure of the structure in your specific population, would be to just see what your exposure food-wise tends to be strongly correlated, either positively or inversely with. And then if there's no common C or U's, then it would be uncorrelated exposures. If you're full fat milk for yogurt, and those would be uncorrelated in your population, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you could maybe inform what foods are candidates by what they correlate with in your specific data.
Yeah, I guess in this case you are thinking about total energy maybe, or background diet,
or if you have full fat for skin as your exposure, and you look to see among those people who are consuming that exposure, what other foods of hundreds or whatever I have in my data set are correlated.
Yeah, definitely. That could give you a good idea of
that strength of the correlation would also inform how strong your U and C arrows are.
Yeah, that also has the a thread that's going towards a more data-driven thing, instead of being motivated by your own research question,
right. Sure.
And by what you may think that's your U, right? It would be a bit the opposite. But yeah, this would be nice to check in your data, just to definitely. Yeah.
Or if you had some full fat milk yogurt a priori, you might check its correlation to see if it's even meeting some of these initial assumptions about the arrows.
Yeah.
You can just answer the first of your questions, which is quite personal.
Uh, this is a very difficult question. I don't know I guess the two types of cheese you can have in fondue are exchangeable, and like it can, like, yeah, having moitié or just Vacherin, it's the same. Thank you.
I didn't know fondue had wine in it until yesterday.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Very nice presentation. And to finalize this round of presentations, isn't Yu-Han presenting?
Oh, yes, I will present.
Oh, that's true. Yu-Han, I'm really sorry because I know you were going to share your presentation. So I think
Yeah, we have to stop. Sorry.
Natalia presented before you. I will let you share your screen. And I'm sorry, Yu-Han. Yu-Han, she's an assistant professor at Penn State College of Medicine, and she's going to be talking about estimating the effects of food substitutions within the Deirde trial framework.
Okay, thank you, Dalia. Can you see my screen? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you, Dalia, for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this very, very interesting symposium. So I would like to talk about a very interesting and important topic in the nutrition epi, which is the food substitution. And before I start, this is a joint work with my colleague Lane Wen in assistant professor of biostatistics in Waterloo, and also my postdoc mentor, Miguel Hernan. And then this is work is still in progress. So if you have any comment, please let me know. I'll appreciate it. So let's start. So food substitution is an important topic in nutritional epidemiology. And most recent dietary guideline actually suggests that for most individuals, achieving a healthy dietary pattern can be accomplished by making simple substitution. So why nutrition epidemiologists care about substitution? So this is based on the rationale that if we ask someone, say Eric, to reduce his red meat intake, he may eat more fish or any other food than he would have if he hadn't reduced the red meat intake. And why substitution is important? Because it's easier to modify a person's dietary behavior without changing the entire diet. So there are two types of randomized trial that can answer the question related to substitution. So the first one you may see is we assign two armed people with the same dietary strategy, except that they differ in the food substitution of interest. This is example we can assign. This is published in a small trial published in the Journal of Nutrition that they assign the red meat diet group versus oily fish diet group. And then the two diets differ in that the amount of red meat versus fish are differ. So this type of trial, they answer the question about effectiveness of the red meat versus the oily fish. This trial is useful, but this strategy does not really consider how do we do substitution from a person's usual diet, because that type of design, I don't care what you eat at baseline. Everyone just assigned to a specific dietary strategy. So the second one that often nutrition epidemiologists are considered is this type of strategy. For example, ask one arm to substitute red meat with fish or any other food. However, if you look at the literature, we rarely see the trial that target on the second type of the randomized trial in the real world. And if there is, the instruction were usually very vague. So for this talk, I want to use a target trial approach to think through how to design the trial under a substitution strategy. And I will describe the potential challenge in estimating the effect of food substitution strategy. And for this talk, we only have 15 minutes, so I will focus on intuition without going to formal identification and estimation. So let's consider the strategy for reducing red meat intake. A common one is reduce red meat without saying anything else. So you may replace by any other food you like. And I call this is unspecified food substitution. And the other one is more specific. It will be, for example, replace the red meat with the same amount portion of the fish. I call this a specified food substitution. Then consider some thought experiment. Now we can randomize 1,000 individuals to either of no intervention versus this type of substitution strategy. And then each strategy will be followed for 2 years, and the outcome on CBD deaths, CBD event at the end of 2 years. And a similar trial you can design for the specified food substitution strategy. And before thinking about this target trial, let me simplify the exposition so we can focus on the key issue. So here I consider the ideal scenario in which we have no loss to follow-up. Adherent measurement is no error. And then I also assume different version of food within each group will produce similar effect, regardless what type of red meat will be the same. And then more importantly here, I assume I have good measurement of the diet and covariate. So in this ideal setup, we can estimate the intention to treat effect, simply compare the risk of outcome in each group. And their difference between the two groups is the intention to treat effect. Suppose now we have people deviate the strategy, which is common in the nutrition trial. The information provided ITT may not be sufficient if we wanted to know what would be the effect if I adhere to the strategy. So in this setting, people may want to know the per protocol effect. And here, per protocol effect will be different from the traditional literature that restricting to people who were follow the strategy. Here will be the effect if everyone had assigned their treatment strategy. To estimate per protocol effect actually is not that straightforward. We first need to clarify what counts as non-adherence. For example, following the intervention, we see an individual, he didn't consume red meat, he had a chicken, he had fish. Is she considered adherence or non-adherence? So this would depend on their baseline intake or their intended intake in the absence of intervention, or how you define your protocol on adherence. For example, we say both ID1 and ID2, they report exactly the same thing following intervention in time 1. But we will say ID1 is considered as no deviation because he really swapped red meat with fish. And then the other person, he actually is swapping the red meat with chicken. So for per protocol analysis, so we first need to define what is adherence. Suppose we already define and collect and measure the adherence. And then suppose this non-adherent occur just completely at random. Then simple, we just censor them and compare the outcome among individuals who adhere to the strategy. So we get a per protocol effect. Now suppose the non-adherent is not completely at random, which is most likely in the real world. Then we need to do some adjustment. What adjustment do we have to consider? There are 2 types of variables. The first type of variable is the covariate that happen before start of the meal and that will affect your intake and the outcome, CBD, for example, exercise. The second type of variable, which is much harder to think about, is how about other dietary components within the same meal? And for the first question, if you collect the data very finely with the fine measurement, you can in principle sort it out what variable to adjust it. For the second one, it's harder because this dietary component occur within the same meal. Now, for the moment, we assume adherence is not affected by other food. Then I draw the DAG. And then this A represents red meat, B is fish, and for simplicity, I put C as other food. Otherwise, I have to put a DAG very complicated. And also, I removed, you can see the note, I removed the note representing the confounder, such as exercise. So you can think about that. We are looking at a straight out of individual with same level of exercise, age, and other confounder. Then this DAG is commonly used in the literature. And under this DAG, you will notice one problem. If I reduce the red meat intake, would it lead to increase or would it lead to decrease or change intake of fish or any other food? It probably doesn't, because there's no path between A to B and A to C. So this DAG doesn't explain the human substitution behavior that was explained in nutritional epidemiology. So one explanation I heard in the past to explain this DAG is that they say substitution, they just add the total energy intake here. And the total energy intake is a sum of the food intake from all sorts of red meat, fish, and other food. And then they condition on the total energy intake and then explain the substitution. So while it's true that when we condition on a collider, such a total energy intake, we will induce association between red meat and other food. This explanation actually doesn't really explain substitution behavior, because it wouldn't be that your total energy intake retrospectively affect intake of fish or other food. And if that's the case, what we are thinking may be that when we reduce red meat intake, you're probably still hungry or still have craving, then you subsequently increase intake of fish or any other food. And then what we measure is the sum of your intake. So that is under the story that I described. This substitution imply there's a temporal sequence of events. Now think about our trial 1, reduce red meat intake and eat whatever other food you like. Then in order to identify what you would eat for other food, had you reduced the red meat intake? Like, for example, what would C1 be? It would require this consecutive measurement that can capture the decision one make regarding to their food intake of A, B, C over time. So now realistic study in 2024, actually we don't contain this timestamp measurement. In fact, we collected summary data of diets over a long period of time. So we cannot really do what we do in that ideal setting. So what do we do? So what can we do now? So there are some possible solutions, but some of them are not ideal. So first, you can assume the non-intervened food, for example, vegetable, fruit, it wouldn't have an effect on an outcome. And in this case, the temporal order doesn't matter because it doesn't affect outcome. You don't even need to consider whether to adjust it or not. But this assumption is generally very strong because it's very hard to rule out which food will not affect CVD outcome. Alternatively, actually, this is what we typically used in many trial emulation paper, is that we assume the food variable, they do not causally affect each other within each interval. So this is the assumption we typically rely in all our trial emulation paper. But under this assumption again, then it probably wouldn't really explain reduced red meat will not affect other component of diet. So the third option I'm proposing here is we can redefine your diet intervention as clear as possible. Ideally on the all major food group that could possibly have an effect on the outcome. For example, for our specified food substitution strategy, we can say, suppose we say maintain the same diet as you had at baseline, except replacing red meat with equivalent serving of fish. So this implicitly actually is an intervention, not only on the red meat, fish, but also specify your other food, keep it at the same level as a baseline intake. And in this case, your dietary variable follows the intervention. So we can circumvent the need to disentangle the temporal relationship between this dietary variable within the same interval. And for this talk, I will not talk about identification under this strategy, but we were going to have this soon. So in summary, substitution implies there's a temporal sequence of events. And because we usually collect summary data of the diet over a wide interval, so when specify the food substitution strategy, it's important to know what food you need to substitute and how. This is what usually nutrition epidemiologists say, replace red meat with fish or with chicken. Also, we probably also need to think about what to do with the rest of the food. And I'm happy to take any questions. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Yu-Han, for your presentation. I think we are running out of time, so we're gonna skip the questions, but please feel free to contact Yu-Han if you have any questions on her presentation. Very clear. Thank you so much, Yu-Han.
Thank you, Dalia.
So now we're gonna go with our last presentation. One sec. So Daniel Ibsen is gonna talk to us about the next steps.
Yes, hello, hi everyone here in the room that are still with us, and also people online that are hopefully also still with us. And yes, so I got this next steps, and I did not change my title as opposed to some other people. But this is a really sort of really happy and really glad that I get to sort of have one of the last talks, so I get to sort of summarize some of the things and look a little bit towards the future. So I guess as of now, we have sort of established that diet is difficult. There are many complexities, but using these causal inference methods sort of framed into this target trial emulation or target trial approach, we can start asking better questions, and our analysis can sort of follow that to answer this. But I think there's one thing really important that we also need to talk about, and that will be my talk. I will just say that I'm funded by the Danish Diabetes Association and the Steno Diabetes Center in Aarhus, where I'm also based, and I'm a postdoc also at Aarhus University and the University of Cambridge and at the University of Copenhagen. Just so let's see here. Yes, okay, but I'm gonna start with a small story, and maybe some of you have heard this story before. So here we have a researcher and a statistician. I will just say that these images, they were created using very advanced AI, right? So that's how a stick figure of a researcher and a stick figure of a statistician looks like. Yes, okay, but the story goes like this. The researcher asked the statistician, hey, I have some data. Statistician, hi, that's good for you. The researcher asked, can you analyze my data so I can find a statistically significant p-value? Statistician, a little bit confused by the question, and then asks, did you design your study to be able to do that? Yeah, the researcher is a little baffled by that question. Really, it doesn't have an answer because it's no, and then the statistician say no. We can imagine a new story here, because I've heard different versions of the statistician story, but we can imagine that we now have a researcher and an expert in causal inference methods. The researcher again says, hey, I have some data. Expert in causal inference methods, hi, good for you. Can you analyze my data so I can know if X food causes Y disease? Expert in causal inference methods is a little bit baffled by this question. And then I ask, did you design your study to be able to do that? Well, not really. Then it's going to be challenging. So this is my sort of simple point, and I'll give some examples of how we can progress, because I think one of the limitations when we do talk about the target trial is that, well, sometimes it doesn't always turn out the way that we wish the target trial are going to look like. And I think one of the sort of the thing that sort of sets the bar for what we can achieve, even with the best methods available, that's the data. And we have sort of alluded to it with different things, and Yu-Han also did that in her very nice talk. But I'm going to give some examples here and end up with a little bit look into the future and a few new ideas as well. So let's start with an observational study, and we have talked about this study, and Dalia gave a really nice introduction, right? But here it's just an example where we tried to do a target trial emulation of this hypothetical intervention of the DASH diet on a 22-year risk of heart failure in a Swedish population, men and women. Yes. So what data did we have to do that? So we had two Swedish cohorts, one was women and one men. And for the female cohort, we had 3 measures of dietary intake. For the male cohort, we have 2 measures of dietary intake recorded by a food frequency questionnaire. What's interesting to note here is that they were taking around 10 years apart, these dietary intake measures. So even though that in the study we do this emulation and do all of these things, we still have some really strong assumptions that within this 10-year gap there are with these dietary measures, that people still follow what we say that the intervention is, how we define it. So we can define the best intervention in the world, but can we be sure that it's the same in this 10-year span? There are, of course, some studies that have multiple measures of dietary intake at very often frequencies, but there are a lot that do not and only have a single measure of diet. So one thing is that if we want to ask these questions about sustained dietary interventions, what would happen if you did this and did it for many years, then we need multiple measures of dietary intakes. I don't think there's so many ways of getting around this. If we turn our attention to intervention studies, well, we have a nice example here, right, of the PREDIMED trial, which was also introduced earlier. But one thing with the intervention studies is that, especially if they're long-term, well, we have an issue with adherence. It's hard to follow a specific dietary intervention for a long time. But we would actually really like to know what would happen had everyone followed that intervention. That is what we are very much interested in. And actually, so this is a really nice example, one of the few ones out there, that in this large intervention, they actually were able to define what adherence is, and they were able to not just define it, but they also monitored it during the intervention. So they had these questionnaires, and Octavio actually showed sort of how they defined it, and they measured it multiple times here. And this is just I'm just highlighting sort of the different questionnaires that they used to monitor if they adhere to the diet or not. And we can say, okay, maybe they could do it in another way, but they did try to monitor this. And they also monitored other sort of prognostic factors after randomization, so they could, again, actually, as Yu-Han also talked about, if people do not adhere and it is related to some other things, it's not just at random who adhere or do not adhere, well, then you can take that into account in the analysis, and you can get to the protocol effect. And this is just to show what they found. So here we have on the top, we have this intention to treat analysis, which was reported in this paper, but they also found that confidence interval is wider, but you can see that the effect having, where we say that everyone had followed the Mediterranean diet for this period, well, it's actually a lot stronger, a lower risk. So to me, that's encouraging, but we see this very, very rarely. And why? Well, because very few studies have the data to do this. Yes, but we need multiple measures of dietary intake and prognostic factors over time in these intervention studies. So we have the cohorts and the interventions. And now I'm just gonna sort of introduce a new thing we've not talked about at all today, these biomarkers of food intake. And that's one thing that I also study, but I think there's a way of sort of connecting these different themes. So this is a study made by some colleagues in Cambridge, and it's a very nice study that uses both data from an intervention study of a Mediterranean diet, and also it looks into a big case cohort that looks in the incidence of type 2 diabetes. But what they did here, sort of very crudely overall, was that they tried to make a score of food intake biomarkers based on the intervention study. So based on what happened in the intervention, they could group people in the habitual diet arm and the Mediterranean diet arm to find a biomarker score that represented the intervention, sort of separated the two groups. Then they took that biomarker score, which was like 29 different food intake biomarkers, and then they used that standardized biomarker score to look at how that would be related in the case cohort study to future development of type 2 diabetes. And what I think is really nice about this study is that they take the data from the intervention, where we are more sure that people did what they were supposed to do, at least had maybe some more help doing this. And then we applied that sort of objective score in an observational study to see how that relates. This study only used like a single measure of a biological sample, like after the intervention, and then looked at baseline and looked into follow-up. But we could sort of combine these things and say, well, maybe you could actually assess multiple biological samples and use that for adherence. Yes. So in a way, I think there could be some way in the future of some sort of unification of these different methods. We have the cohorts, we have the target trial emulation. We're interested in the protocol effect. We need some data for that, the good high quality longitudinal data. We also have the intervention studies, a few long-term intervention studies, but we also need high quality longitudinal monitoring of the diet and different covariates in that, so we can also get to the per protocol effect. And maybe we'll be able to do a better benchmarking, comparing actually more apples to apples with that. And then another layer, I think, is these food intake biomarkers, where we could, for instance, in a cohort study, we could nest a small intervention of a random sample of the people. We give them a very highly controlled dietary intervention for a few weeks. We measure, we develop some sort of biomarker score that represent that intervention, and we can use that further on to follow up people if they adhere or not to this exact intervention. Of course, we can only do it for that one, but that's at least one idea, I think, where we could sort of bring together some of these different really nice ideas. So some more the biological data with this causal inference method. So ultimately, I think we have a lot of good studies, but I think we definitely need new studies that from the beginning think about these causal questions in the design of this. So I'll just end with this new story. So we have the researcher again, and we have this expert in causal inference method. And then the researcher asks, hi, I want to collect some data. Hi, sounds very interesting. Can you help me design my study so I can know if X food cause Y disease? Yes, I'd love to do that. So I hope we can not just take all the methods. Of course, we can work with the data we have today, but I think we also need to think about the data of the future and put all these good ideas, but also think about how we incorporate that into the design of the studies for the future. So with that, just say thank you.
Do we have time for questions? I don't.
Yes, but there's no question.
Okay. I don't know if there are questions here in the auditorium. Okay, so I just want to thank everybody that stayed with us for the 4 hours of symposium. I also want to thank the speakers and the people who are here with us today. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any further questions, and thank you so much for being here.